Okay, the next item of business is a debate on motion 15792 in the name of Craig Hoy on delivering a common sense budget for Scotland. I'd invite members wishing to participate in the debate to press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible, and I call on Craig Hoy to speak to and move the motion. And Mr Hoy, around 11 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last week's budget continues on a path well trodden by the SNP. More tax, more excuses, poorer public services, and an abundance of smoke and mirrors to mask the absence of economic growth. The SNP has form. It repeatedly seeks to evade responsibility for its actions, and our motion today sets out the choices that the SNP could make, decisions that would be in Scotland's national interests, not in the SNP's interests. But as always, SNP ministers never learn. They focus on inputs, not outcomes. The Scottish Government's high tax agenda repeatedly fails to deliver value for money for ordinary Scots. It fails to deliver better public services, and it fails to deliver public service reform. And despite Scotland's record-high taxes, the tax take continues to be weak. The SNP have imposed £1.7 billion more in income tax, yet the net tax position is only expected to be £800 million. This, the Scottish Fiscal Commission says, is an economic performance gap under the SNP. In contrast, we set out in our plans to improve our economic performance through fully costed tax cuts for ordinary Scots. I will in a moment. Tax cuts for bus drivers, nurses and teachers. The average Scottish worker £222 a year better off. Nearly 2.7 million people getting a real cut in their income tax bill. And compare this to the SNP's cynical move to freeze the lower tax threshold last week, which saves most taxpayers just £1 a month. A pound shop budget from a pound shop government. And I'll give way.
Michelle Thompson.
Mr Hoy, along with myself, is on the Finance Committee, and yesterday when the Scottish Fiscal Commission were in front of us, I specifically brought up the terminology around economic performance gap. And if Mr Hoy had been listening in that session, he would have heard the Scottish Fiscal Commission making clear that it was nothing to do with the actions of the Scottish Government. That isn't a public record. I'd invite you to reread that again and also ask, is this further evidence of the Hetty Wainthrope style of new front bench?
Always through the chair, Craig Hoy.
We're getting the cheap insults in early. What I heard yesterday was the Scottish Fiscal Commission issuing a series of warnings on tax and spending to this Scottish Government. Now, we, in our plans, don't just set out plans for tax cuts for workers. We set out tax cuts for home buyers, many who Scottish estate agency Galbraiths say are shocked when the SNP's property tax bill lands on their doorsteps. Our fully costed move would save Scottish house buyers an average of £800, taking 70% of transactions out of the tax regime altogether. I will make some progress, and I will give way shortly. This would mean more money for young families who are getting their homes together, less for the SNP to waste on pet projects and fringe obsessions. But we didn't just set out plans that would cut the taxes for workers. Our plans would cut the tax for many pensioner households too. Households forgotten by Labour and cynically dropped from the SNP's budget this year. As winter approaches, I agree with the SNP that it was Labour who originally scrapped the winter fuel payment. But despite their attempt to grab headlines, the SNP then scrapped it too, and they haven't restored it. Now, many pensioners this winter will get nothing at all, and only £100 next year. And as the mercury dips, what is different about the temperatures this winter compared to next winter? Is it that the SNP have calculated that by next year the election campaign will be well underway? And do they really think that it is okay for pensioners to freeze at home this winter, but that somehow they do not need to do so in an election year? And yes, we should be looking to save £2 million for free bus travel for asylum seekers this year, if at the same time the SNP is taking the winter fuel payment off our pensioners. Deputy Presiding Officer, we need to look to business to drive growth in Scotland. So that's why we don't just propose cutting taxes for average Scots. We want to undo the damage that the SNP has done to many Scottish businesses. Across Scotland, retail, Hospitality and leisure businesses are struggling. Footfall is down, costs are up, and the SNP are clobbering them with more red tape. And now Scottish Labour has dealt a business another blow, a national insurance tax on jobs for sectors where the wage bill is often by far their biggest cost, a national insurance tax which, as the Institute for Fiscal Studies pointed out, will also fall on workers through lower wage growth. And that's why we want to mitigate the cost of labour and the SNP with a tax cut for many businesses next year. By passing on the 40% rates relief to shops and leisure businesses, and we want also a game-changing, uncapped 100% all-in relief for our pubs and restaurants. This would benefit nearly 3,500 pubs in Scotland and 3,300 restaurants. But instead, the Scottish Government's budget offers relief only to small businesses with a rateable value of £51,000 and less, and only at the 40% rate. Surely, what industry deserves now is a shot in the arm, and I hope that ministers might think again on extending relief during the coming budget negotiations. Now let's turn to some of the key areas in the budget. The SNP is right to press the UK Government for an uplift to cover the costs of the national insurance increases. Whether the UK Government does this is still unclear. But what is clear is that the Scottish Government pays civil servants higher wages than elsewhere in the UK, and that there are more of them on a per capita basis. So the national insurance increase bites harder into the public finances as a result of the policy decisions taken by the SNP on both the shape and the size of its civil service. I will take an intervention.
Minister. Does he not recognise that there are significantly more teachers, doctors, nurses, midwives, police officers per head of population in Scotland than there are across the rest of the UK, and also that they get paid more, in fact several £1,000s more in their take-home pay after tax than the equivalents received down south?
Craig Hoy.
To learn a lesson. Yesterday we found out there are fewer teachers and there are fewer doctors, but what I do know is that under the SNP there are more spin doctors. In its budget response, the Scottish Fiscal Commission points to a clear set of public pay risks within this year's budget. Unlike last year, and we welcome this, the Scottish Government has published a public sector pay policy, but the Government is proposing a 9% package over 3 years, 2 points higher than the inflation estimate. That is in itself a risk, given the Government says its revenue budget position remains very tight. Yet, while the budget makes provision for pay awards, it makes no provision for pay progress. In other words, those people moving up the pay scales. This, according to the Scottish Fiscal Commission, leaves a 1.5% black hole in the SNP's pay plans. So the question is this for the Minister when she speaks: how do you intend to pay for it? Because the Government's plans make no reference to reducing the headcount. And the Spice briefing given to the Finance Committee makes clear that the budget constraint is compounded by staff costs. In other words, public sector pay is simply not sustainable under this SNP administration. Now, we give a cautious welcome to the £30 million for a programme of public sector reform. But it doesn't necessarily need to follow that you need to spend money to save money. But we will look closely at the plans when the Public Finance Minister brings them forward next year. But in reality, how committed is this SNP government to delivering meaningful public sector reform? Will it now remove quangos that duplicate work? Will it reduce core civil service headcount, which has risen significantly since COVID? Will it wage a war on waste? Because if so, then that £30 million will be well spent. Because let's look at what SNP waste looks like in this budget alone. £60 million to the Woke Equalities and Human Rights portfolio, £50 million to Ferguson Marine this year, even though the ferries were meant to be completed 2 years ago. Up to £50 million on a national care service that even... No, I don't have time. Up to £50 million on a national care service that even its own councils now do not support. £8 million on baby boxes that many new parents don't want, don't need and don't use. £5.5 million on fake foreign embassies. £12.8 million on a foreign aid budget while foreign aid is reserved. £5.5 million on external affairs policy and advice. And £2 million for a Scottish Land Commission crammed full of SNP cronies. Presiding Officer, unpicking this budget reveals that the benefits bill under the SNP is now unsustainable. with the Fiscal Commission warning it will reach £9 billion within 5 years. And even before it removes the two-child benefit cap, nearly £1.5 billion is being spent more in benefits than the Scottish Government is receiving in the block grant. And in evidence to the Finance Committee yesterday, the Scottish Fiscal Commission revealed that the Adult Disability Benefits Bill is to surge by hundreds of millions of pounds because of the soft-touch system that underpins it. Professor David Ulf said 6 Scots were staying in benefits longer than the rest of the UK, with the DWP removing claimants on review in England at a rate of 18% compared to just 2% coming off disability benefit in Scotland. This poses what Professor Ulf described as, and I quote, a significant risk in terms of sustainability of benefits in Scotland. But as the SNP benefits bill soars, the budget continues to cut in core areas. The enterprise budget down £33 million, £110 million taken from rail services in cash terms and reductions in cash terms to drug and alcohol services. And a council settlement that fails to make up for last year's council tax freeze and a decade of cuts, which will force many councils to increase council tax next year. Now, it's clear that the government has more money than ever before, but what the government is going to do with it is less clear, as the Fraser of Allender Institute has recognised. Now, we welcome the increased funding for health, but more money alone will not solve the crisis in our NHS. It needs leadership and it needs a delivery plan. And that's something that is evident from today's headlines. The Herald, number of GPs drops again. The Daily Mail, A&E delays evidence of NHS collapse. And the Scotsman, bed blocking high 9 years after the SNP pledged to end it. So whether this budget cuts funding or increases it, we know that under the SNP, our public services are only getting worse. Presiding Officer, the budget was bad for business, it was bad for taxpayers, it was bad for Scotland, and that's why the SNP urgently need to change course, to back our pro-growth tax cuts, to reform public services and to restore sustainability to Scotland's public services. Deputy Presiding Officer, I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you, Mr Hoy. I now call on Shona Robertson to speak to and move Amendment 15792.3 up to 9 minutes. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. Presiding Officer, I welcome any opportunity to talk about the draft budget, but I think there's one particular aspect of the Conservative motion that I think it's incumbent on us all to condemn. I know there are members of the Conservative benches who deeply value all the communities they represent and will deplore the terms of the Tory motion today. And knowing those individuals, I don't believe for one moment that they condone the Farage-esque dog whistle attack on asylum seekers that's at the rotten core of today's Tory motion, or Craig Hoy's description of our important equality work as woke. It's frankly embarrassing. I suspect it's more likely that they agree with the joint call from the Church of Scotland and the Scottish Catholic Church today, that as a Parliament we must, and I quote, resist attempts to divide our society and instead show support to people who have come to Scotland seeking sanctuary and new beginnings. And I couldn't agree more. Presiding Officer, I've welcomed the discussions with all parties represented in this Parliament and organisations beyond as we prepared the draft budget. And along with Ivan McKee, I look forward to them continuing as we approach the next stage of the budget process. Our budget last week is a product of that engagement and is focused on delivering progress and hope. Our approach to economic growth, the social contract and progressive taxation are fundamental in achieving this. Scotland's economy is one of the best performing parts of the UK. One of the most important factors in realising this has been attracting foreign direct investment. In fact, a record number of foreign direct... I know the Tories don't like to hear good news about the Scottish economy. I'm going to tell them it anyway. In fact, a record number of foreign direct investment projects were secured in Scotland in 2023, maintaining Scotland's position as the top-performing area of the UK outside of London for the 9th year running. And the Scottish Fiscal Commission forecasts Scotland will have higher earnings growth and lower unemployment than the rest of the UK in 2025-26. Hopefully that's something Craig Hoy could welcome.
Craig Hoy.
I thank the Minister for taking an intervention. Just for the record, can she state how much she is receiving from the UK Government to extend rates relief to Scottish retail, leisure and hospitality, and how much is she actually spending in this budget? Cabinet Secretary.
So the consequentials are about £145 million, but the reason that we have to be very careful in what we allocate this year is that there will be no consequentials next year from the UK Government for rates relief because of the changes to business tax. So what Craig Hoy and the Tories want us to do is to bake in unsustainable tax cuts, unaffordable, unsustainable tax cuts into the public budget that will mean cuts to public expenditure. Those are the choices that have to be made, and we're delivering support to 13,000 hospitality premises through affordable support to hospitality. And the positive change that we're delivering for the people of, not just at the moment, I'll let you in a moment. The kind of positive change that we're delivering for the people of Scotland, the Tories want to put at risk by doing away, for example, with our international network of offices. In 2023-24, the SDI international network costs were about £11 million, and in return, over £2 billion in exports were delivered. Far from being common sense, it makes no sense to get rid of that network of international offices. This is a sort of sound investment for Scotland that we'll deliver, rather than engage with the Tories' trustonomics. And I'll let Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Alex Cole-Hamilton.
I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for taking my intervention. She mentions the relief in the hospitality sector that's been felt by the planned rate relief that was announced in the draft budget. Does she recognise there is still pain, however, in our retail sector, which is still struggling to recover from the worst of the pandemic, that is seeing the decimation of our town centres, and that they are equally deserving of some kind of support?
Cabinet Secretary.
The position we have put forward is one that we think is balanced and affordable and focused on hospitality. And of course we will continue to have discussions, but any money that we put into this budget for rates relief is going to have to be baked in, because no money is coming for rates relief from the UK Government next year, because they're changing their business taxation system. It's going to be entirely self-funding from higher rates properties, and we can't replicate that here because we don't have the number of higher value properties that they have. So whatever we do this year is going to be baked in, and we need to bear that in mind. The environment is also not exempt from the Tories' ire. This budget is delivering £4.9 billion in positive climate spending, from public transport through to nature investment. The Tories say that they want to merge various environmental agencies, but of course fail to spell out which ones and why that would be beneficial. They say this budget shouldn't pass, but ignore the economic opportunity that investing in offshore wind will bring to Scotland. Presiding Officer, while Christmas is just around the corner, the letter we received recently from Russell Finlay would have made Scrooge blush. In that letter and today's motion, there is a call for tax cuts, which the Tories' own estimate says would slash public investment by £1 billion. Take note, Alexander Stewart. Russell Finlay has said that the cuts in his letter are, quotes, fully costed, yet has never produced a breakdown of these costs for them to be scrutinised, and perhaps Craig Hoy will publish that today. They talk of cuts to social security, but refuse to say what benefits they would cut. Presiding Officer, perhaps I can clear up the sort of scale of cuts the Tories are calling for. £1 billion is more than the total cost of adult disability living allowance and the Scottish Child Payment, combined about £877 million. And if the Tories are claiming they wouldn't cut these, then what welfare support are they wanting to cut? It's time for them to come clean with the detail. And not content with this, they appear to have a new front in Russell Finlay's bargain basement attempt at starting a culture war. This time it's babies, Presiding Officer. Russell Finlay clearly thinks that babies are a left-wing cabal living on handouts who have had it too good for too long. along, and now he wants to scrap the baby box. It appears that all the work to try and stop being the nasty party might have been in vain. I'll take an intervention if I have time.
Briefly, Murdo Fraser.
I'm grateful to Cabinet Secretary for giving way. I think she needs to work a bit harder on our pre-scripted gags, given the response from the Chamber. But on the issue of welfare spending, surely we shouldn't be happy about presiding over exponentially expanding welfare spending year on year. What we should be doing is getting people off welfare into work. That's what this government should be doing.
Cabinet Secretary, I'll give you the time back.
And that's why, of course, we're investing in employability. But you see, the Tories, when it comes to unsustainable...
First Minister, if you could maybe resume your seat a second. I've allowed a little bit of leeway in terms of reaction to what's being said, but we do need to hear the person who has the floor. In this instance, the Finance Secretary, who has taken a number of interventions. Finance Secretary, please continue.
It is strange that the Tories only talk about unsustainable funding when it comes to welfare. They don't talk about unsustainable tax cuts that would take £1 billion out of public spending. They're very selective with what they describe as unsustainable. Presiding Officer, eradicating child poverty is this government's top priority, and indeed it should be the priority for all parties in this chamber, given that they unanimously supported the statutory child poverty targets. And to help achieve this, we'll continue to invest in increasing income from social security and benefits, increasing income from employment and reducing the cost of living. And vitally, we'll put the systems in place necessary to effectively scrap the two-child benefit cap in 2026, supported by £3 million in this budget for that work. Today's Labour amendment complains that there isn't enough focus on outcomes. Well, I'm happy to tell the Chamber that the outcome of scrapping Labour's two-child benefit cap will be to lift a further 15,000 children out of poverty. Universal winter fuel payments for pensioners and scrapping the two-child benefit cap. If Labour's position is that this is now what they are against, then I ask, what on earth are Labour for? This budget protects the social contract at the heart of this government's approach. It includes free bus travel for young people under 22, as well as those with eligible disabilities and over 60s. It includes the universal reinstatement of the winter heating payment, which was a core cross-party ask delivered, with £101 million invested for the benefit of pensioners across each constituency and region in Scotland. So, finally, Presiding Officer, today I think is a bit of a Rubicon for the Conservatives. Morally and electorally, the question for the Tories is simple. Do you really think you can stop the electoral threat that reform poses to you through appeasement rather than principle? The answer is yes. Frankly, it really is too late for the Conservative Party, and I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I call on Michael Mara to speak to and move Amendment 15792.1. Around 7 minutes. Mr Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I move the amendment in my name. Can I begin with full-throated agreement with the Cabinet Secretary on the appalling motion that's been tabled today by the Conservatives? And frankly, I think it is... Frankly, it's beneath many of you and does a disservice to you. Seeking to pit one vulnerable group against another in our society is simply unacceptable. It's the kind of politics that says, I can only get on if others do not. And that's a politics that I entirely reject. Asylum seekers are some of the most vulnerable people in our society. They have fled unimaginable situations of war, famine and persecution. They are not... No, I will not. They are not, no, I will not. They are not political pawns to be used by the Tory party to try to outflank reform on the right. And the condemnation, Presiding Officer, the condemnation of this motion from the Catholic Church and the Church of Scotland, not my words, I'm going to give you some of them right now. I am angry about this. I am angry about this, I have to say. The Church of Scotland say we should really urge all of our politicians to use language which upholds human rights and human dignity for everyone in our society. The Catholic Church urges us all to welcome the stranger and to love our neighbours as ourselves, that this is particularly relevant as we approach the season of Christmas. The Holy Family themselves were refugees, and the encouragement and solidarity that we can show in our political debates to those who find themselves on the margins is as important as ever. To have Christmas explained to the Conservative Party, certainly.
Murdo Fraser.
I'm grateful to Mr Barry for giving way. Is he not just a little bit embarrassed? He represents a party that has slashed the winter fuel allowance for the most vulnerable group of people in our society, pensioners. What a brass neck Mr Mara has.
Michael Mara.
There is certainly a debate, and it's one that we have regularly in this chamber, about the winter fuel payment. There is also debates about how many parts of the budget may be spent, but by purposely pitting one group against another, not just in motions, but in graphics spread online, specifically offences, because I can tell you there's many things in the budget that we disagree with, Presiding Officer, many things. The contrast could have been waste. It could have been ferries. It could have been inefficiency. But instead, this is the one that you draw. You know why you've done it. You know why you have done it. And there are flaws in our tax system, I have to say, Presiding Officer. As the experts have told the Finance Committee, the Scottish system is unduly complex, and they are economically inefficient. Anomalies that are due to the interaction of the Scottish and the UK system. But the reform of the tax system that we actually need, not as proposed today, does not equal the swinging tax cuts that this country cannot afford. And frankly, we've been there before with the Conservatives. But there is a record £5 billion of additional funding in the Scottish budget for 25-26. And let's be clear, the only reason that any of the measures in the draft budget are now possible is because of that record investment in Scotland delivered by a UK Labour government. The largest settlement in the history of devolution. That's the difference that 37 Scottish Labour MPs have made on government benches speaking up for Scotland. But it is not at the moment, sir, thank you. But it is not easy. And it is as a result of the dreadful inheritance left us by the party opposite, the last Conservative government, that difficult decisions have had to be made to rebalance the public finances and deliver that investment. The record investment is only possible because of those revenue-raising measures. Employer national insurance contributions, ending VAT exemption on private school fees, a proper windfall tax on oil and gas giants. But in the process of that budget, the SNP demanded £70 billion of additional spending. But at every turn, they've opposed the means by which this money was raised. £45 billion of revenue raisers opposed. A net fiscal turnaround of £115 billion demanded by the SNP government. Frankly, incredible. So last week, the SNP did come to the chamber and tell us what they would spend the money on. And this week, the Conservatives are calling for what they want that money to be spent on. But neither party are prepared to actually accept any of the means by which the money was raised in the first place. And I do think that the draft budget was a missed opportunity, but certainly not in the way that Craig Hoy thinks. Because it is clear that Scotland is going in the wrong direction. Just this week, teacher numbers fallen by 621. 1 in 3 children routinely missing school. A&E performance at its worst point since January. GP numbers falling. 2 weeks ago, Aberdeen Royal Infirmary forced to declare a critical incident and divert ambulances. The Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Glasgow in similar situation, and all before the worst of winter bites. And yet the First Minister insists there is no need for a new direction. Authoritative voices like the Auditor-General, the Scottish Fiscal Commission, the Fraser-Valander Institute, again and again telling us about the looming risks to Scotland's public finances posed by challenges including an ageing population and the climate crisis. Those challenges mean that change is needed. Not just a case of spending more money, but spending the money differently, of doing things differently. So last month, the Auditor-General was excoriating in his criticism of the Scottish Government's failure to deliver the necessary leadership to help deliver a programme of reform. On the NHS, he said fundamental change in how the NHS services are provided is now urgently needed. The budget was a wasted opportunity to set a new direction, to signal that this government was listening to the Auditor-General's increasingly exasperated warnings. But responses to the budget were clear that it does nothing to address those challenges. David Phillips of the IFS said it does not inspire confidence that much-needed reform will actually happen. Ros Foyer, General Secretary of the STUC, said the budget fails to tackle the big transformative challenges Scotland faces and dodge the critical decisions we need to see, designed to set up the government for victory rather than set up Scotland for transformational change. The Fraser-Valander Institute concluded that the difficult decisions have been kicked into the future rather than planned for. This is not a budget that will deliver the new direction that our public services so obviously need. While the Tories, frankly, have lost the plot, the SNP have lost their way.
Thank you, Mr Manna. I now call on Ross Greer around 6 minutes. Mr Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Nasty and desperate. It's a description that fits this motion and the party that have brought it here today after 14 years of incredible damage and deliberate harm done by the Conservative Party to society at large, but to our most vulnerable communities in particular. And the Catholic Church and the Church of Scotland, the latter of which I'm a member, made it clear to MSPs today they expect us not to pit vulnerable groups against each other. And their call reminded me of that famous cartoon of Rupert Murdoch, where he's sitting round the table with two ordinary workers, one black and one white. And he's sitting with a mountain of cookies on his plate. The black worker has one and the white worker has none. And Rupert Murdoch points at the black man and says to the white man, "He stole your cookie." That is the ethos of the Conservative Party, to sow division between ordinary people. And that's their ethos because they exist to protect the interests of those who are really at fault. The Conservative Party exists to protect the company bosses who rake in huge profits while paying their workers poverty wages, the billionaires who hoard more wealth than they could spend in 100 lifetimes, the landlords who hoard housing and trap their tenants with unaffordable rents. The enemies of ordinary people, Scottish or British, don't arrive by dinghy at Dover. They arrive in this country by private jet. And the Tory party has always been ready to stand in service of those real villains, not the general public. We should be proud of Scotland's record when it comes to progressive taxation. £1.7 billion available next year for our public services as a result of the choices that we have made since 2017. And what's that the equivalent to? Well, that is the equivalent to funding the Scottish Child Payment, lifting and then holding tens of thousands of children out of poverty. The Best Start grant and the baby box that, as the Cabinet Secretary pointed out, gets the Conservative Party irrationally angry. Under 22 free bus travel that has been life-changing for so many young people, particularly from our most deprived communities, particularly care-experienced young people. Just in a moment, the adult and child disability payment that is a stark contrast with the unbelievably cruel, denigrating system designed by the Conservative Party at the DWP. I'll take Ms Smith's intervention.
Liz Smith.
Committee, as I do, and he is well aware of what the Scottish Fiscal Commission has been saying for many, many months now, that we simply do not have the revenue in Scotland to be able to pay for all the things that he's just listed. Is it not the case that we have to make some difficult choices to ensure that we get our fiscal sustainability back?
Ross Greer, and give you the time back.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And on the principle of fiscal sustainability, I agree with Liz Smith, but why, when the Conservative Party demand difficult choices, do they think that that always has to equate cutting the services that the most vulnerable people rely on, rather than asking those with the broadest shoulders to pay a bit more to protect those services? And the doommongers on income tax in particular have been proven wrong. Since 2018, they've told us again and again of the huge shortfalls in revenue that would result from a more progressive system. And that's just not what's happened. Overall tax revenue is up. Inward migration into Scotland from the rest of the UK, including of higher earners, is positive. Now, I think it's absolutely fair to want more data on the behaviour change impacts that could have arisen as a result of income tax changes, on whether pension contributions have risen as a form of avoidance, for example. But it is not right to claim disaster without evidence. And the same applies to land and buildings transaction tax. The evidence has now shown consistently for years now of LBTT outperforming projections. And on the Conservative suggestion of cutting it, I would have to point out that we also have years of evidence from across the UK and elsewhere that cutting taxes like this doesn't help first-time buyers because it increases property prices. It is better for the people selling, not for the people trying to buy and get on the property ladder in the first place. Even increasing the additional dwelling supplement hasn't made a dent in revenue. And frankly, that one probably should have, because it is designed in part to affect behaviour change and to reduce the number of second and holiday homes. And I am very glad, I welcome that the Scottish Government's agreed to the Green proposal to increase that once again, which should raise more revenue, but hopefully also have that behaviour change impact and help us to tackle the housing crisis. Presiding Officer, Scotland, like every other developed nation and many others, faces huge challenges with unacceptable levels of child poverty for such a wealthy country, a climate and nature crises that are out of control, massive challenges with mental and physical health. The free market won't solve these challenges. Government needs to lead efforts to do that, and the public want and expect us all to do that. And those challenges are different for different groups in society. There are 2 Green proposals to the budget that demonstrate that. Free ferry travel for young islanders, because that recognises that under-22 free bus travel has benefited young people in island communities as well as on the mainland, but not to the same extent that it has those on the mainland, and they deserve recognition of the fact that ferries are key to their lives. Free bus travel for people seeking asylum as well, though, and the key word there is people. These are people seeking asylum, and it is a privilege to be in a position as a country and a society to help the most vulnerable. The Tories talk about value for money, and there's huge value for money value for money here, because of course people can't integrate, they can't participate in their community if they're isolated. They can't access healthcare, and that ends up costing the NHS much more later on. But of course it would be far easier to support people seeking asylum if the UK government had simply given them the right to work in the first place. The reality, Presiding Officer, is that the Conservatives want a smaller Scotland and a smaller UK. They want us to be more isolated. They want less investment. They don't want to realise the potential of this country. They don't want us to live up to the privilege that we have and the duty that we have to support the most vulnerable people across the world. Fortunately, this afternoon will prove to them that they are very much in a small minority in that sad view of what this country can be.
Thank you. I now call Alex Cole-Hamilton, around 6 minutes. Mr Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I usually rise and talk about being pleased to speak in debates in this Parliament. It's a privilege to speak here, but I don't feel that today. This was a thoroughly depressing afternoon, and I look across at the Conservative benches. I see a number of parliamentarians I respect very greatly, who often raise the standard of public debate in this place to a very pinnacle. I can't believe that this motion is drafted in their name today, and I hope they take a long, hard look at themselves, because if there weren't so much to refute in this motion, if there weren't so much to debate against it, I wouldn't really want to give this motion the time of day, so shrivelled and miserly it is. And Michael Mara, I thought, was quite right in the terms of his amendment to call out the Conservatives for cynically pitting 2 groups of people against each other, 2 groups of very vulnerable people in Scotland against each other, pensioners and refugees. Yet in the same breath, they are seeking to strip hundreds of millions of pounds out of our budget through unfunded tax breaks. It is possible, Presiding Officer, to argue against the policy with decency without, quote, condemning it, as the Conservative motion proposes to do, especially when we are discussing a group of people who the Scottish Refugee Council tell us may be living on as little as £1.36 a day. If the Scottish Conservatives are genuinely interested in value to taxpayers, then consider the impact of free bus travel in terms of what it can mean for integration, early intervention, for getting to Home Office appointments or accessing language sessions to help integrate the refugee community into the Scotland they want to make their home. It would free up capacity in the charities who spend time and money helping people get to where they need to be. If you want to reduce the cost of supporting asylum seekers, and we all do, then let's talk about lifting the ban on their working if they've been waiting more than 3 months for a Home Office decision, so they can support themselves, so they can contribute back to the country in which they have sought safe harbour. Our immigration system was broken by the Conservatives. Their dysfunctionality made the asylum backlog soar. By closing down safe and legal routes to sanctuary, they left desperate people to make perilous attempts across the Channel in leaky boats, in the hands of criminal smugglers and of traffickers. And if the Conservatives were genuinely interested in value for money for taxpayers, in common sense, they wouldn't have wasted £700 million on the shameful and morally bankrupt Rwanda plan. Presiding Officer, the SNP government can get by without winning many votes. In a parliament of minorities, it doesn't need to pass legislation, though voters are entitled to question why they want to be in power if they do not. However, it is practically impossible to run the country if you can't pass a budget for the year ahead. Therein lies the rub. and the dilemma that currently faces Scottish ministers. We know that the SNP have been in power for too long, and that in their 17-year record is now catching up with them. Just look at what we've learned so far this week alone. More people stuck in hospital than ever before, unable to return home or to a care home because the care system is on its knees. There are fewer GPs. Family carers are struggling to get by, and the number of people waiting 12 hours in A&E is 139 times worse than it was when the SNP came to power. The SNP promised thousands more teachers, but we've actually seen their numbers reduced by 621 this year. More of them are stuck on temporary contracts, and pupils aren't getting the in-class support that they need. It's why Liberal Democrats know that the only thing that would truly bring about the change that Scotland needs is a change of government. To me, that sounds like an enticing prospect, but it is not as simple as that. If we reach the start of a new financial year and this Parliament has failed to pass a budget, failed to agree tax rates, then things will quickly break down. So against the reality of that backdrop, I and my party have sought to find common ground and to improve the lot of our constituents in the pages of the draft Scottish budget. We are still some way from a deal with ministers. Our support is not guaranteed, and as I told the Chamber last week, but you can see significant Liberal Democrat demands baked into the pages of the budget's first draft. There is the reinstatement of the winter fuel allowance for pensioners, spending on social care, affordable homes, family carers, additional support needs, GPs, dentists, long COVID, the Belford Hospital in Fort William, Edinburgh's Eye Pavilion. I could go on. All of these were key Liberal Democrat demands, and they are in the budget because of us. Our priorities reflect our continued commitment to get constituents fast access to healthcare, fighting for a fair deal for carers, lifting up Scottish education and growing our economy. These are the issues that come up in my surgeries, and I'm sure in your surgery, Presiding Officer, week in, week out, which is why we're determined to put them there, front and centre. There are now 8 weeks before this Parliament votes on this, and whether we back the budget in the final analysis will depend on the detail of the commitments made so far and what progress is offered on the other key priorities that we will lay out. Business rate relief, as I said in my intervention, does not go far enough. I want to see money dedicated to alleviating the drug death crisis, which remains one of the worst in the world. And we need that spending protected. Our nurseries need fair funding if they are going to deliver the affordability and the flexibility that working families in modern life still need. And in a Parliament of minorities, Presiding Officer, it is incumbent on all parties to pore over the detail, make the case for our constituents, find common ground where we can, and see if we can make a way forward in this budget. Thank you.
Thank you. We now move to the open debate. I call for Sanders Gulhani to be followed by Kenneth Gibson. Dr Gulhani, around 5 minutes, please.
Deputy Presiding Officer, perhaps Michael Mara should turn his anger upon his own party for cutting the winter fuel allowance. How many pensioners must die before he speaks out against this disgusting Labour policy? I refer members to my register of interest as a practising NHS GP. The Scottish Conservative motion... No, you've had your turn. Have a seat. The Scottish Conservatives motion rightly critiques the draft Scottish budget for 25-26 as failing to deliver value for taxpayers and failure to adequately audit where every penny goes and what output we get. This budget perpetuates the SNP administration's high tax agenda, an agenda that stifled economic growth and left Scotland's vital public services, particularly health and social care, in crisis. And Labour's destructive policies, such as the national insurance hikes, have led to this damage becoming catastrophic. Both parties claim to be progressive, but in reality they are anything but. The SNP boast of allocating £21 billion to health and social care, including a £2 billion increase for frontline NHS boards, a so-called record uplift. But what does this mean in practice? More hollow promises and no coherent plan. Money doesn't replace leadership. Access to GP appointments is worse than ever. A&E waiting times are catastrophic and delayed discharges have reached an all-time high. Throwing money at problems without a strategy isn't governance, it's negligence. Audit Scotland's scathing assessment makes it clear. fundamental change in how NHS services are provided is urgently needed. Yet this government continues to dodge difficult decisions, offering vague intentions instead of actionable solutions. Deputy Presiding Officer, Scotland doesn't need more empty rhetoric. We need leadership with the courage to act. The reality is damning. Dr Ian Kennedy of the BMA highlights the lack of resources and strategic direction. Colin Pullman of the Royal College of Nurses described SNP workforce planning as disastrous, leading to record delays in discharges, ballooning waiting lists and cancer treatment targets unmet for over a decade. The SNP has left the NHS in perpetual crisis, failing both patients and healthcare professionals. This marks an interesting and critical opportunity to spotlight the severe challenges faced by both staff and to patients. Yes, I will.
John Mason, briefly.
Well, I thank the member for giving way. He seems to be arguing for more resources for the NHS. Would he support tax increases to do that?
Dr Gohani.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. We need to use our money more wisely and know where every penny goes. It is not about inputs, it is about outputs. 4 GP practices serve 17,000 patients in a crumbling facility ill-equipped to meet Drumchapel's growing healthcare needs. And that is because of longer appointments necessitated by language barriers among asylum seekers who are going to Drumchapel. Urgent upgrades are overdue and the Scottish Government must prioritise addressing these deteriorating conditions. The Scottish Conservatives offer a better way. We would prioritise primary care, committing 12% of the NHS budget to it immediately, increasing to 15% within 3 years. And by strengthening our GP services, we move healthcare closer to people's homes. This focus on preventative medicine will also reduce hospital strain and improve patient outcomes. We would slim down an obese bureaucracy. This isn't just fiscal prudence, it is transformative healthcare delivery. On mental health, the SNP budget is equally deficient. While overall health spending has reached record levels, mental health funding has been cut from a promised £290 million to £270.5 million. This reduction is a slap in the face to those struggling with mental health issues. We would ring-fence mental health funding to ensure it gets the attention it deserves. And Labour fares no better. Their national insurance hikes threaten health and social care providers. GP practices face an average cost of £20,000, while charities like Sea Change Scotland are being pushed to the brink. Sea Change, it employs 235 staff and projects additional costs of £183,000 due to these hikes, jeopardising their ability to provide essential services. Hard-pressed charities delivering public services cannot absorb such financial pressures. Deputy Presiding Officer, the SNP's warped priorities exacerbate these crises. The SNP consistently chooses ideology over pragmatism, leaving ordinary Scots to pay the price. This Parliament must confront the harsh reality. The SNP's record on healthcare is one of failure, and Labour's policy is making things worse. Scotland deserves better.
Thank you. I now call Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Tim Eagle around 6 minutes. Mr Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think we had 14 years of clear evidence that the Tories certainly don't have the answers after the chaos they left the economy in when they squirreled out of office early in July. This is, of course, one of these days in which the opposition declares the SNP government's draft budget to be tantamount to the end of civilisation as we know it, while Scottish ministers view it as a vital step on the road to a land of milk and honey. Of course, the reality is somewhere in between. That's why it's important for each party to be open-minded about what can be achieved in the weeks ahead, and where compromise can be reached and a balance struck. Grandstanding is no such place in these deliberations. It was therefore disappointing to read Russell Finley's rather terse letter of 18th of November to the First Minister, in which he huffily declared, "We don't agree with your spending commitments, so we expect you will look elsewhere for a budget deal." Regardless of what the 25-26 budget might contain, the Tories, constantly looking over their shoulders as their votes, members and councillors drift to reform, won't play ball. So the demands made today in their motion are meaningless. And if the Tories have the fully costed proposal Mr Finlay promised, where are they? Today's motion has more holes than a Swiss cheese. And interestingly, in the debate following this one, Jeremy Balfour calls for £10 million for changing places toilets. Why then isn't it included in the Tory motion? The Tories now talk of outcomes. This will come as a surprise to many because the Tories have demanded more money for free school meals, winter heating, ScotRail peak fares and a plethora of other areas costing over £2 billion since early September alone. In fact, we've already heard some today. I mean, Dr Gulhani was talking about Hindi translation services earlier on. I don't know if they've actually costed what that might actually come to, but it's just another addition of Tory cost that they never actually give us they never tell us how much it is actually going to cost. Russell Finlay called for the social security budget to be looked at, whatever that means. I doubt it's a view of Jeremy Balfour, who earlier this year called for social security spending to be the Scottish Government's, and I quote, #1 priority. And Jeremy, Miles Briggs and Ros McCall all supported free bus travel for people seeking asylum in Paul Sweeney's parliamentary motion last year. I trust they will have the courage of their convictions and won't support the Tories' reprehensible motion today. As one might expect of a disciple of the discredited Liz Truss Prime Minister only 2 years ago, let's not forget, Mr Finlay has no clue as to the numbers. But to be fair, he has only so many fingers and toes. The Tory ostrich approach, closing Scotland's international offices, shows that they don't want to attract investment and jobs to Scotland. These offices strongly contribute to Scotland being the top destination for foreign direct investment of the UK's 12 nations and regions outside London, according to Ernst & Young's annual attractiveness survey. The Canada office supported more than £120 million in planned capital investment, while Washington DC supported more than 360 companies. The Tories want to put that at risk. Closing them seems to me more about marginalising this Parliament than common sense. Keen on low taxation? So why did the Tories vote against this year's council tax freeze or deliver the highest UK tax burden since the war? Tory-led Aberdeenshire is now considering a 17% council tax rise compared to 5% for SNP-led North Ayrshire and 3% in SNP-run Dundee. The Tories demand Scottish ministers cut income tax to 19% for those earning up to £43,662, a rate lower than they set in any of the 14 years when they formed the UK government. Of course, this would easily cost over £500 million based on the 22-23 Scottish income tax outturn statistics. Where would they find that? Of course, old lags will recall 2009 when Labour came to then Finance Secretary John Swinney with a list of demands they had to meet to secure their votes. After Mr Swinney met their demands in full, Labour reneged on the deal and when first presented, the budget fell. A week later, it was represented without a single word being changed and a curmudgeonly Labour Party voted for it to avoid an election where their defeat looked certain. Such antics take us nowhere. Labour since July is more cautious, with Big Brother in office now at Westminster. First, they backed the UK's decision to deprive most of Scotland's pensioners of their winter fuel payments, then clumsily reversed gear a few weeks later. We now hear fewer demands for £40 a week Scottish child payments, given the equivalent in England and Wales under Labour is precisely zero. It's less now about inputs than outputs for them too. We will see. According to the Scottish Fiscal Commission, resource spend will only be £400 million higher in real terms, and that's before we consider the impact of national insurance increases. There are many aspects of last week's budget we can and should support regardless of party affiliation. The Scottish Police Authority spending increasing by 4.5%, housing investment up over 57% to £768 million, supporting the delivery of 8,000 new affordable homes, education and skills, a 3% increase over and above inflation. And locally, for me, funding for NHS Ayrshire and Arran up by a whopping £123.1 million, 13.9%, taking it to over £1 billion. Across Scotland, over 95% of non-domestic properties will pay lower tax than anywhere else in the UK, with over 100,000 taken out of rates altogether. The UK Labour Government's decision to raise employers' national insurance contributions adds £549 million to the cost of delivering Scotland's public services, while bodies such as independent care homes, charities and universities must find £210 million to meet rising national insurance costs. While Labour and Tories play politics, funding for essential services such as healthcare, education and infrastructure are held hostage. Meanwhile, the SNP government is backing the people's priorities, eradicating child poverty, growing the economy, improving public services and tackling the climate emergency. Presiding Officer, it's clear that today's hand-knitted Tory motion is incoherent as well as shameless. By contrast, if passed, this budget will deliver for Scotland's communities and businesses, supporting a wide range of services, many of which are not provided elsewhere in the UK, including free prescriptions and free higher education. The Scottish people expect their elected representatives to set our differences aside and deliver on the priorities of people across Scotland. That will only happen by supporting the budget.
Thank you. I now call Tim Eagle to be followed by Alec Rowley. Up to 5 minutes. Mr Eagle.
Well, it's certainly been interesting, Presiding Officer, and can I remind members of my register of interest as a small-scale farmer? The initial excitement that I felt as I sat through my very first budget statement last week was sadly quite short-lived. For what I got was a budget deeply damaging to rural Scotland. Many will still be paying more tax in Scotland than they would do living anywhere else in the UK. Many will still be paying more in land and building transaction tax than the equivalent in England and Wales. Small business owners will be paying more tax because this government chose not to extend that vital business rate relief to pubs and restaurants. But for rural communities, like the many in my own region, this budget cuts even deeper. When the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs and a Minister addressed the large crowd outside of farmers, this very building only a few short weeks ago, they said they would listen to their rallying cry for help and it would be reflected in the budget. But did the SNP really listen? No. They cut the rural budget in real terms. The Institute of Fiscal Studies confirming a 3.1% real terms cut. Justify that, Cabinet Secretary.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, facts are important, and the rural... Facts are important, and the Rowley budget increases by £22 million in real terms going into 2025-26, taking resource and capital together. The farmers wanted the payments in capital rather than resource. £22 million more for the rural budget. Get your facts straight.
But can I just remind members that they should be speaking through the chair, and that goes on all sides. Tim Eagle, and I can give you the time back.
Well, I think the Cabinet Secretary really needs to go and have a discussion with the Institute for Fiscal Studies, because that's not what they said in their own report. The rural portfolio was the only area to receive a real terms cut. Even the SNP's government's Constitution Department, or in other words, the department that promotes Scottish separation, received a real terms rise. That's what this government think of rural Scotland. That's a real kick in the teeth for Scotland's farmers, crofters, land managers and rural communities. The NFUS and Countryside Alliance Scotland described the real terms funding cut as disappointing, with the latter commenting that Holyrood needs to start taking rural Scotland more seriously. And Scottish Lands and Estates said that rural Scotland have been sidelined in the budget and that the budget does little to move the dial on supporting communities in the long term. To top it all off, the SNP's cast iron promise to return the £46 million taken in previous years sees it return over 2 years, maybe, in a capital transformation scheme of which we have no detail. There was a call for multi-year funding, again undelivered. Now, there is an argument that the SNP could, if they so choose, guarantee a minimum funding level for future years, assuming the money is forthcoming from the UK government. I don't believe it is unreasonable to ask for that. They didn't deliver it. I believe we could and should be doing more, and I'm proud of this party for standing up for our rural communities. The SNP's route map still tells us little of what future support will look like for our farmers. What of the EEC scheme, which sees a reduction in funding? Will that be accessible once again? I doubt it. LFAS is still paid at a level set in 2018, and there is no change to basic payment scheme rates. I could go on. Woodland funding has increased by 20%, but this follows a 41% cut in the previous year. £90 million for peatland and trees is welcome, but would that really be enough to cover the ambitions that the Scottish Government have set? A carbon land tax has been mentioned. That's right, another tax from this government that we don't know anything about. Nature Scot, who deliver much of what I've already said, has a £9.9 million cut to funding. Nature restoration funding, a £4.2 million cut. But it's not just our farmers that were hit by this budget. Scotland's marine sector has also been landed what looks like a real terms cut of £3 million. We are simply not doing enough to look after our fishermen at present. There are far too many stories of poor science and unknown landings. The Marine Directorate is far from perfect, and having spoken to numerous fishing organisations, many want significant reforms in this area. But any reform or improvements won't be delivered by slashing budgets. My worry is that these cuts represent an anti-rural Scotland attitude. Do I have time?
No.
No. My worry is that these cuts represent an anti-rural Scotland attitude. And the simple fact is that time and time again, the SNP have put the interests of rural communities on the back burner while continuing to plough money into niche Hollywood bubble issues. Whether it's boosting the budget for its own growing number of international offices, whether it's sending money to foreign states for climate reparations, the SNP has completely lost touch with what taxpayers expect of this government. This budget should have been a game-changer for rural Scotland. At a time when rural communities face the challenges of depopulation, a lack of housing, a lack of reliable transport options, a lack of adequate connectivity infrastructure, a lack of access to local NHS and social care services, this SNP budget has been found wanting. And more broadly, this government has taken bold action. This government could have taken bold action to give taxpayers a boost, help home buyers, give home buyers a helping hand and give struggling businesses some relief. Presiding officer, there is another way, as set out by my colleague Craig Hoy. You can cut taxes to stimulate spending and growth. You can help out young people on the property ladder. You can support businesses by reducing the tax burden on them so that they can invest, and it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. The Scottish Conservative plan would open up Scotland's economy, give businesses hope again, and put more money into people's pocket. That would boost us all, including the rural Scotland that was left behind last week.
Alec Rowley to be followed by Michelle Thompson. Up to 6 minutes, Mr. Rowley.
Presiding officer, when I read the motion put forward by the Scottish Tory Party for today's debate, I just felt a sense of sadness and despair that a mainstream political party in Scotland would put forward such a motion to this Parliament here today. And it wasn't just, I think, me or many members in this chamber that felt that sense of despair, because the Church of Scotland and the Scottish Catholic Church have issued a statement urging MSPs to resist pitting vulnerable groups in our society against one another. Indeed, the chair of the Justice and Peace Scotland also issued a statement, and I want to put it on the record. She said, "As we strive to realise social justice for all in our society, Justice and Peace Scotland remind everyone of Christ's teachings to welcome the stranger and to love our neighbours as ourselves. This is particularly relevant as we approach the season of Christmas. The Holy Family were themselves once refugees, and the encouragement and solidarity we can show in our political debates to those who find themselves on the margins is as important as ever. In this season of goodwill to all people, I hope that all these discussions will be characterised in a spirit of kindness and generosity." And that's why Labour in our amendment started off our amendment by rejecting wholly any attempt to pit vulnerable groups in Scottish society against one another for political ends. So I would appeal to the Tory party in Scotland, do not go down that road of trying to create division. We've had enough division in our society. There is enough division in the world without trying to create more division just to try and score cheap political points here and there. I would also point out to the Tory party that we cannot approach this debate in budget and look at the massive challenges we have in Scotland by simply ignoring the failure of Tory austerity and the impact that that's had on communities and on people up and down Scotland. The impact on local services, the increased cost of living, poverty rates rising. Even the IMF concluded austerity policies from the Conservative Party did more harm than good. So that's the starting point, in a sense, for where we have to try and rebuild our society. And it would be good for Craig Hoy and the Tories to at least acknowledge that. But turning to the SNP and their budget, my concern, I think, and I have raised in here continually, is there is a failure to join up the budget with policy. And far too often over the years I've been in this place, I've seen the SNP government throw money at things without any clear strategies, clear policy on how they're going to address the issues, indeed what the outcomes are that they want from throwing money at things. And there are many examples. The failure in social care. I have argued in committees and argued with ministers that one of the clear failures in social care that we have is the failure to properly pay and give carers decent pay, decent terms and conditions. And while some progress has been made there, not enough progress, whilst at the same time trying to implement a national care service, spending so far £28 million and making really no difference whatsoever. Those problems are still there. And as we see the massive pressure on our acute services, as we see the ambulances queuing up outside hospitals and we get told that this is a result of bed blocking, the failure to actually address the problems in social care is resulting in that. And that is an example of a waste of money. The failure to properly workforce plan across a whole range of services, again, a failure. And may I stress, a failure to work with local government, to see local government as a key partner. And what we've seen from this SNP government over many years is a centralisation of local services, a power grab from local government into this Parliament. I have commented before that this government has also almost tried to create and turn this place into the Big Toon Council of Scotland. And it wouldn't be so bad if they were actually any good at trying to then deliver those services. So if we want to get more for our resources, then we have to build the partnerships with those on the ground that are able to deliver. I could go through item after item after item of failure after failure after failure, because there's been a failure to link the budget with policy, to build a partnership with local government and to deliver for Scotland. I do hope that this government will change tack and start to work with local authorities, work with their partners and invest in people in social care and elsewhere.
Thank you. I now call Michelle Thompson to be followed by Liz Smith. Up to 6 minutes. Ms Thompson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today we're asked to debate half a motion at best. Some of it's been dealt with eloquently by many in this chamber, and I add my voice to the dismay at seeking to isolate and deny refugee seekers support. The rest is full of sound and fury, signifying not nothing, but certainly a lack of any coherent analysis and proposals. The Tories imply they're concerned about growth, but by arguing for significant reduction in tax take, although lacking any precision as to the scale, they effectively offer us a return to austerity. They are unable, or is it unwilling, to specify precisely where their main cuts will fall, and that's the rub. Much of what's in the Scottish budget has been widely welcomed, not of course by the Tories, but by many key groups in our society. As the Scottish Fiscal Commission have specified, there's a considerable uplift in many critical areas, including an 11.1% real terms growth in the net zero and energy portfolio, a 3.7% real terms growth in the Deputy First Minister's economy portfolio, and a 3% real terms growth in education skills. Now, these three areas are all central not only to growth, but the type of sustainable growth much needed in Scotland. All speak to the focus on the type of investment needed to support sustainable growth. How much of this would the Tories' proposals compromise? Their motion is silent on this, of course. And it tells us much about this latest version of the Tories. Not so much a shot in the arm, but a shot in the dark. And of course, I want us to move further in the opposite direction to the Tories to enhance growth. Projections both at the UK level and Scotland level suggest that the available increased expenditure from the capital budget will provide stimulus for growth, but noticeably primarily in the short term. So for the medium-term and long-term growth we require in Scotland, we must find a way to further increase investment for growth. And in that regard, I say again that the constraints on Scottish Government borrowing because of the current fiscal framework are unwelcome. And I've regularly argued we need the freedom of independence to maximise our capacity for investment, since the Unionist parties are opposed to giving the Scottish Government the necessary freedom to borrow to invest. That said, I continue to watch with interest the potential for a bond for capital investment, and I'm sure we will hear more about this in due course. Given my interest in music and culture as convener of the cross-party group on music, I very much welcome the Government's commitment to a significant increase in the culture budget. Scotland's cultural assets are not simply just nice to have. They make a huge contribution to the attractiveness of Scotland, not least to the tourism sector and to the attractiveness of Scotland as a place to do business and for highly skilled individuals coming here to develop careers. This is investment for the enhancement of our quality of life, and I applaud the Government's actions in this area. I also welcome very much the reinstated investment commitment for housing. Indeed, investment in house building and renovation not only has benefits for individual living, but are a particularly effective form of investment for encouraging growth with a significant multiplier effect. Chamber will know I've long made commentary on ScotWind money, so I was pleased to note the £300 million will be protected going forward, and also the allocation of £25 million for green supply chains. The effective use of these funds is something that I'll continue to retain an interest in. My final comments reference the Labour Party motion. Of course, I agree it is important to address long-term challenges of fiscal sustainability. But I remind the Labour Party, if Scotland, that this Scottish Government has had to abide by an age of austerity ushered in by the Tories, but now regrettably adopted with some enthusiasm by the Labour Party, who appear to be making the very same mistakes as the Tories with their low-growth budget and continued adoption of Brexit. And as for vision, I'll happily give way.
Daniel Thompson. I'm very grateful to give way, but does she not at least acknowledge that we have raised money through fiscal measures, the UK Government through fiscal measures, and extended an additional £5 billion through the budget? And that might not go as far as she might like, but would she acknowledge that is quite different to the previous budgets by the previous UK Government?
Michelle Thompson. I absolutely do acknowledge the increased amounts, particularly in revenue, but the point I'm making is that considerably more needs to be done for the UK budget to be considered in any way going for growth. And that's not just my view, that view has been made extensively by other bodies. And as for vision, the SNP has it in droves. This is why people look with envy to Scotland, protecting the weakest and most vulnerable. And no bolder vision for me personally is an independent country taking its place in the world with a vibrant, dynamic economy that supports treating its citizens with dignity, with respect, and where there is hope for a better future for young people. So the choice today is between a half-baked motion and a return to austerity, or to choose the path of progress being taken by the Scottish Government. It's an easy choice, and I'll happily be opposing this motion.
Thank you. I now call Liz Smith to be followed by Stuart McMillan. Up to 5 minutes, Ms Smith.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Now, as far as I can understand it, the Scottish Government's argument for its determination to mitigate the two-child cap, apart from, of course, wanting to wrong-foot Scottish Labour ahead of the 2026 election campaign, is that the mitigation is an integral part of the so-called social contract with the people of Scotland. The problem is, apart from the fact that a very large chunk of the electorate actually want to retain the two-child cap, is that the policy has not been costed. We have no idea, in fact, about how much it's going to cost. The Scottish Government seems to be telling us that it's between £100 million and £150 million, and that seems to change by the day, whereas the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Scottish Fiscal Commission both putting the total somewhere around the £300 million mark. And of course, all this comes at the same time as the Scottish Fiscal Commission was estimating a fiscal uplift of £578 million for social security between this year and next, while the Scottish Government is telling us it will be £800 million. Now, I do not need a calculator, Cabinet Secretary, to work out that that gap is £222 million. So little wonder that Professor Graham Roy has rightly described this move as, I quote, a fiscal risk. Yes, if she wants to explain how Graham Roy's
the Scottish Fiscal Commission will cost the policy fully over the coming weeks, as Liz Smith knows. But talking about fiscal gaps, where will the £1 billion of tax cuts fall in public sector expenditure? We've not heard any answers to that so far. Will Liz Smith tell us where that cut will fall?
Liz Smith, I can give you time back.
Liz Smith will be very happy to spell out some of this in due course. But what the Cabinet Secretary has got to answer is why people like the very respected Graham Roy is saying that we have a very considerable fiscal risk within the Scottish Government's budget proposals. In fact, we've got the Fraser Valander saying that the lack of detail is very troubling and there are far too many unknowns. And worse still, in announcing this policy a week and a day's notice beyond the SFC's deadline, as Graham Roy has described it, the SNP has gone against all the warnings of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, Audit Scotland, the Finance Committee of this Parliament, that there needs to be far more transparency about Scottish Government budget projections and much greater accuracy of cost. So when the Cabinet Secretary is having a go at other parties about cost, I think she should look closer to home. In Table 2.5, under the heading of Public Sector Pay Metrics, in the Scottish Fiscal Commission's most recent report, line 2, the Scottish Fiscal Commission had to write the word blank for 3 years in a row because there wasn't a public sector pay policy. Instead, overinflation pay awards to the public sector, considerably larger than, of course, is the case in the rest of the UK, but for nothing in return. And the Auditor-General reminded us at the weekend that the medium-term financial strategy, yet again, is delayed. And there has been no detail when it comes to public sector reform. Indeed, it could be argued, I hope it's not true, but it could be argued that the fact that the Scottish Government has actually received an increased block grant will be used as an excuse not to engage in more public sector reform. And I don't understand why ministers can't see that. So the Scottish Government's priorities are all about increasing benefits under the aegis of the social contract without the necessary evidence, whether that's qualitative or quantitative, about which social policies actually deliver positive, measurable outcomes. And they come, of course, at the expense of prioritising the needs of business, which is already deeply alarming for both our business and hospitality and all the sector with the tourism. Do I have time?
Brief intervention, Mr Hamilton.
I'm grateful to Liz Smith for taking my intervention. Does she recognise that actually enabling refugees, some who are living on less than £2 a day, to travel around this country to better integrate into the societies in which they've settled and sought safe harbour is actually a very positive social outcome that every member of this chamber should aspire towards?
Liz Smith.
I think, Mr Cole-Hamilton, I think it's about making choices, and we could argue very strongly that we don't want to have any detrimental impact on pensioners. But what I'm saying, and what I am saying, and what I think is very important about the future debate on social security payments, is to ensure that we have the evidence available to decide where we put the important spending of very limited resources. And in this instance, the amount of money that pensioners could get is far more important than in many cases for the asylum seekers. And I will finish on that point because I think when it comes to the Scottish Government's budget proposals, it's all very well saying that this is a wonderful budget and things. It's not a wonderful budget at all. And it's not a wonderful budget because the actual arithmetic has not been properly done. And that's why you have the economic analysts who are very critical of this budget. And I'll finish on that.
Thank you, Ms Smith. I now call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Paul Sweeney. Mr McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm just going to start off with kind of taking up Craig Hoy's comment earlier on with regards to Ferguson's in Port Glasgow, unsurprisingly. I actually think that Craig Hoy has done his colleague Graham Simpson a disservice, because Graham Simpson has taken part in the roundtable discussions about the Yard, about investment, and has been supportive of the workforce at the Yard. Now, Craig Hoy earlier spoke about and touched upon the fact that Glen Sannox is no longer there. That's true. Thankfully, the Glen Rosa is still being outfitted. So if there is no money going to Ferguson's, then the work for the Glen Rosa doesn't happen, and the ferry doesn't finish, and island communities will not get the ferry. So I'm sorry, Mr Hoy. Mr Hoy was absolutely wrong and incorrect in his assertion in his comments earlier on. Now, the motion from the Scottish Tories, it says it all about their thinking. They are clearly rattled by the challenge on the political right. And this motion is nothing short of an attempt to pit one vulnerable group against another. And the Tories, it's already been touched upon in the Chamber, but the Tories really would do well to actually heed the joint statement issued today from the Church of Scotland and also the Scottish Catholic Church. I want to quote from Jill Kent, the chairperson of the Justice and Peace Scotland, when she said, and I quote, that the Holy Family were themselves once refugees, and the encouragement and solidarity that we can show in our political debates to those who find themselves on the margins is as important as ever. The joint statement also highlights how important this small investment will be for people who are not permitted to work and often are living on as little as £8.86 per week. And for asylum seekers, public transport is completely unaffordable, something Alex Cole-Hamilton just touched upon in his question a few moments ago. Now, a day ticket in Glasgow costs £5.60. That equals more than half of people seeking asylum's weekly allowance. And access to free bus travel would be positively life-changing and mentally transformative for those otherwise stuck in an inadequate and slow asylum system. Now, surely this £2 million is actually an investment to help keep people out of accessing mental health services in the NHS. Now, during their 14 years in government, asylum seekers, refugees and migrants, irrespective of their circumstances, were labelled as being the source of the UK's problems. Now, Presiding Officer, many asylum seekers reside in my constituency and have for several years now, yet are prevented from working. Now, asylum support provides just £49.18 per week, or just £8.86 per person per week, if in a supported accommodation. I'm sorry, Mr Kerr, I need to make some progress. I'll try and get you in later. Now this leaves just £7.02 per day for the essentials, or just £1.36 in supported accommodation for essentials like transport. Now, we've all seen how the Tories treat asylum seekers by leaving them languishing in accommodation whilst their applications take an age. Now, Labour historically was a party known for its social democratic values. Now, surely then it should be the Labour UK government pledging to support asylum seekers and speed up the asylum process across the UK. Now, I'm not sure if that will happen because, as we've already seen, it was the Labour Party in the UK government who have removed the winter fuel payment for millions of pensioners and also still allowed the children to remain in poverty by continuing with the two-child cap. Now, Presiding Officer, the Tories' motion also mentions a tax system. Now, in Scotland, those with the broader shoulders pay a little bit more, enabling Scotland to spend more on the things that matter most and also on the policies that people elsewhere in the UK do not get. Now, free prescriptions, free university tuition and the game-changing Scottish Child payment are just 3 examples of SNP delivery. Now, this is a far cry from the Tory policies designed to enrich their friends while making the average member of the public worse off. Now, plus, opposition parties never mentioned that when taking tax and social security choices together, over 60% of Scots in 2025-26 are set to be better off because they live in Scotland. Now, Presiding Officer, that the SNP do not need to take any lessons on the economy or taxation from the party that gave us Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. And it's worth reminding the Chamber that, as has been the case for each of the 17 budgets, that this SNP Scottish Government has set balanced budgets, because they can only spend what they are given. Now, there is a welcome funding increase. There is a welcome funding increase from the Labour UK Government for 25-26, but it doesn't go far enough. And it certainly is not going to unravel 14 years of Tory austerity, something themselves, the Labour Party, have already acknowledged time and time again in this chamber over the last wee while. Okay?
Briefly, Daniel Johnson.
So I'm grateful to Stuart McMillan. He says it doesn't go far enough, but the SNP revenue-raising measures would have only raised £16 billion. Our budget raised over £40 billion, coming straight. And likewise, on capital budgets, it increased by 12%, which was apparently one of the key issues that the SNP had. So where does it not go far enough?
And Ms McMillan, you've got about 30 seconds. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you, President. That's the thing, Mr Johnson. I mean, giving with one hand, but also taking it away from the other because of the national insurance contributions. Something that is going to affect, something, as Mr Johnson will know, it's going to affect the public authorities, the third sector and also the private sector across Scotland. So, Presiding Officer, just in closing, the economic aspects of today's debate was typical of each of the parties, but the othering of one vulnerable group, pitting them against another, is a new low from the Scottish Tories front bench. And there will certainly be some Scottish Tory MSPs who will be ashamed of this position, and I don't blame them.
Thank you, Ms McMillan. I now call Paul Sweeney to be followed by George Adam. Mr Sweeney.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I share the dismay and frustration expressed by members across the chamber at today's motion tabled by the Conservative Party. And it is increasingly clear that they are desperately in pursuit of voters on their right flank and so are therefore seeking to replicate the divisive politics we have seen play out in the Reform Party and today have chosen to punch down on people seeking asylum in Scotland in pursuit of this pretty ignoble objective. There are people in this country who have fled persecution, political oppression and conflict. And that is the point. They are not some abstract persona, as the Tories would have you believe. They are people that desperately need our help. I know that at first hand because I represent around 90% of people seeking asylum in Scotland. Since I launched the campaign to extend concessionary bus travel to asylum seekers in Scotland with the Red Cross Voices Network and Maryhill Integration Network 3 years ago this week, the campaign has enjoyed robust support from across civil society, the third sector and, crucially, cross-party support in this place. And as has been mentioned, that includes members of the Conservative benches. So it is disappointing to see their new leadership turn their back on the most vulnerable in our society, with both the Roman Catholic Church and the Church of Scotland uniting to issue a statement today condemning their mendacious cynicism, particularly pernicious as it is in the middle of Advent. In Glasgow, where around 5,000 of the approximately 5,500 people seeking asylum live, along with the member for Maryhill and Springburn, who I'm happy to take an intervention from.
Bob Doris.
I thank the President of Paul Sweeney for the intervention. Can I commend Paul Sweeney for his role in that campaign, which I was happy to support on a cross-party basis to secure free bus travel for asylum seekers, and I detest also the position of the Conservative Party in relation to that. On that cross-party basis, I wonder if Mr Sweeney would also support the submission made by the Scottish Government on the right-to-work pilot for asylum seekers that's currently sitting with the current UK Government together on a cross-party basis, furthering the rights of the most vulnerable and isolated in society, our asylum seekers.
Paul Sweeney.
I'd like to thank Mr Doris and also Mr Ruskell for their early support and critical support in this Parliament for supporting the objectives of the free bus travel project. And indeed, I share his sentiments as co-chairs, conveners of the cross-party group on migration. It's something we have long sought to achieve in the UK, and I think we would like to see progress on giving people seeking asylum the right to work after appropriate periods, rather than the continued interminable limbo that so many are kept in for so long. So I agree with his point, and indeed that limbo is the key issue. The cost of an all-day bus ticket in Glasgow is £5.60. People seeking asylum rely on a financial stipend of just £7 per day to cover the cost of living. And for those living in accommodation that provides meals, the allowance is just £1.26 per day. The adult single bus fare in Glasgow is £2.95. A child single bus fare is £1.60, not even covering that cost alone. These are people that are at present prohibited from getting a job or accessing most social security benefits. They are therefore the most deprived cohort of people in the country. Having to fork out £5.60 for bus travel to attend medical, social or legal appointments is quite simply not an option unless they go without food or other essentials. I've heard pretty harrowing accounts of that, as many members have. Crucially, concessionary bus travel also enables people seeking asylum to integrate into their new home country, discover their new place of residence and begin to restart their lives. It is a socially just policy. I've stood in this chamber several times in the last 3 years articulating the benefits of extending free bus travel to people seeking asylum. We should hear people with lived experience of the asylum system in Britain so that the Conservative members know who they are demonising when they use their opposition day time to create division between pensioners and asylum seekers for their political convenience. One person that is seeking asylum in Glasgow, Deputy Presiding Officer, said, "This will allow me to meet with friends, access education and connect with the community. It will allow me to have some form of freedom. We already live in an open prison at hotels. Notable to meet friends, travel, isolation, and to overcome isolation. We only receive £8.86 per week. It will help me to live a little more of a normal life." Another said, "For someone seeking asylum, a free bus pass is more than a card. It's a chance to explore, to access help and to feel a little less invisible." This scheme does so much more than just provide free transport for new members of our community who are seeking sanctuary. It begins a process of integration so that they can feel part of their new community. We must also remember that the Conservative government spent the atrociously wasteful sum of £700 million on the failed Rwanda scheme, and they now have the audacity to come to this chamber today talking about a common-sense budget. I can, by my own calculation, reckon that wasted funding on the Rwanda scheme would have covered the cost of free bus travel for people seeking asylum for 350 years. Deputy Presiding Officer, that's how ludicrous and risible the Tory position has ended up. In contrast, free bus travel for asylum seekers costs a small sum, but it will have a profound impact on some of the most marginalised people in Scotland, giving them access to healthcare and other vital services. The policy would equate to a 0.2% increase in the number of people in Scotland benefiting from existing free concessionary travel schemes. And when we started the campaign, we coined the slogan, "For such a small change, it would make a huge difference." And we stand by that because it is true today as it was in December 2021. It is a rounding error in the Scottish Government budget. The costs are negligible, with the implementation costing around £2 million a year, according to the Government's own estimate. That is 0.003% of the budget. The notion that it is unaffordable is simply risible. Crucially, these are people that do not wish to be here necessarily, but have been forced to flee their home countries seeking safety. Free bus travel allows them a modicum of dignity to begin to rebuild their lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Sweeney. And I now call George Adam to be followed by Douglas Lumsden. Mr Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was sitting here listening to the debate, wondering how I would start my speech here today. And I was struck that there was a time, Presiding Officer, where we had an exchange of ideas in here. We didn't always agree with one another. We had an exchange of ideals and ideals, and we'd find a way to negotiate, to find a way forward. But when Craig Hoy of the Conservatives comes up and says things like the baby box is a pet project and move away from bus passes for asylum seekers, we are way away from that world and that time in this chamber. I've no idea what the Conservatives got this anti-baby policy from. I don't know what the babies of Scotland have done to the Conservatives. But possibly, Presiding Officer, I may be at fault at that, having 4 grandchildren, and I do sit down and tell them about the future Scotland that I want, and every story starts with, "Never trust a Tory." But why would you trust a Tory when they're sitting here, they're attacking asylum seekers? The kind of future I want for my children, my grandchildren, is the compassionate future where you will look at people that are needing help at that difficult time and you will actually put out that hand of friendship and try and make a difference in their life. That's the future, that's the ideals that I have, and most of us in this chamber have as well. Is this where the Tories are at now? Is this they are? Are they now more Trumpian triumphalism by the Tories as they continue to lurch to the right? But the thing is, Presiding Officer, Tories will do what Tories do and continue to talk Scotland down. And I will always look to the future and put a forward, positive future for our nation. The Scottish Government's draft budget for 2025-26 is a budget that demonstrates both fiscal responsibility and social conscience in these challenging times. A budget that represents not just numbers on a page, but a vision of hope and opportunity for every person in Scotland. This is the budget that puts the needs and priorities of our people first, investing in their future and ensuring Scotland continues to thrive. At its heart, this budget represents a clear commitment to protecting the most vulnerable in our society, while ensuring the sustainable delivery of vital public services. The introduction of a universal winter heating payment shows our dedication to supporting those most affected by the cost of living crisis, particularly our elderly citizens, who should never have to choose between heating and eating. This year's budget is clear in its purpose: to deliver progress on issues that matter most to the people of Scotland. The Scottish Government are committed to eradicating child poverty, growing our economy and improving public services like the NHS and tackling the climate emergency. It is a bold, compassionate and forward-thinking budget, a budget for Scotland, by Scotland, for Scotland. So when we talk about common sense budgeting, is that not exactly what the proposed Scottish Government budget is? Are we not here to support the people of Scotland and give them hope for that future? Is it not our place to ensure that we are able to look at our constituents in the eye and say, we did the right thing? The Conservative narrative in this debate hasn't changed since the publication of the budget. They just continue down the same cynical attack lines, which I find extremely disappointing. They appear to have run out of any positive ideas as they look over their shoulder to see Nigel Farage and his cronies looking to replace them. But there is another way, Presiding Officer. There's another route for all of us, and that is to embrace the Scottish Government's budget and the proposals it makes. Those who plan to oppose the budget really need to ask themselves why. Why would you vote against a budget that has the needs of the Scottish people at its heart? And it does have the heart. It does have heart, as the Scottish Government looks to the needs of our communities in these very challenging times. Let me be clear about the context in which the Scottish Government budget has been crafted. Despite the usual Westminster-imposed constraints, the Scottish Government has made progressive choices that reflect our values and our priorities. The opposition motion today attempts to pit vulnerable groups against each other, a deeply cynical approach that I, for one, and everyone else in here seems to wholly reject. Again, they look over their shoulder at the shadow cast by reform, as they haste to become the Conservative Party to this debate to the lowest point ever. That is not what this place is all about. It's not what this place has been about from day one, and it's not our values or Scotland's values. They continue to listen to the noises of the far right, but unfortunately, that's where the Conservatives find themselves. The Tories in Scotland dance to Nigel Farage's tune. This isn't common sense. This is an unacceptable jump to the right, and it's not what we are all about. Our Scotland believes in and trusts in our communities. Equally, the Scottish Government needs to work to continue to retain that trust, and that is a partnership in Scotland that has worked with the SNP since the SNP came to power in 2007. You retain that trust by looking at the options that the Scottish Government proposes in this budget. This budget takes meaningful steps to support all vulnerable groups, including our commitment to effectively scrap the two-child benefit cap in 2026, a policy that will make a real difference to families across Scotland. Where will Labour stand in this? Will they continue to be at the wrong end of this debate and not support the Scottish people, or support this budget? Critics of the Scottish Government claim the Scottish Government are pursuing a high-tax agenda, but let's examine the facts. Our progressive approach to taxation ensures that the majority of Scots still pay less than they would elsewhere in the UK, while generating vital additional revenue that supports our public services. This is about creating a fairer, more equal society. Presiding Officer, in closing, let me say this. This budget embodies the resilience, the creativity and the compassion of Scotland. It represents the kind of future we want for our families and our communities and our nation. Together, let's seize this moment and work towards a brighter, fairer and more prosperous Scotland.
Thank you, Mr Adam. I now call Douglas Lumsden to be followed by John Mason. Mr Lumsden.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And what an important debate we have in the Chamber today. Because with the budget, the SNP-devolved government have yet again let down the hard-working people of Scotland. They have let down its young people, the working population, our industry, our business owners and our investment opportunities. Quite a record after 17 years. This is a government that is out of ideas, out of policies and hopefully will soon be out of office. In the area that I represent, the north east of Scotland, we have seen businesses closing, the oil and gas sector betrayed, growth receding, and there is nothing in this budget to give any hope for those vital industries and jobs of which the north east depends. And let's look at some of the detail. The SNP administration has announced funding for offshore wind. Looks good in a headline, but any further scrutiny leaves us wondering exactly what this money will pay for. It's capital, which narrows it down, but seriously, there is zero detail in where it will be spent, what it will be spent on, and what difference it will make to the net zero economy. Chasing headlines is all this lot are about. As a party, we are eager to welcome any investment into the future of wind energy, particularly in terms of encouraging production and manufacturing in this country. But there is zero detail for the net zero aim. There is no climate change plan. There is no strategy. There is an administration making big promises with zero intention to deliver. It gives a whole new meaning to the term net zero. This government will earn its title as a net zero government, but not in terms of energy. It's net zero in terms of delivery. There is no sign of the Just Transition Plan, and there is very little mention in the budget of a just transition. That seems to have gone out the window as well. Instead, we are once again talking about a cliff edge of investment in our North Sea oil and gas sector. We know that the Labour and the SNP plans will both mean tens of thousands of job losses in the North East. And this budget will have a major negative impact on economic growth of the North East. Our towns, our communities, our families and hard-working Scots who see their pay packets penalised simply for living and working in Scotland. The Just Transition Fund was meant to be £500 million over 10 years. We're now 3 years in, and where are we? Just £15.9 million in this year's budget. They are so far behind in their commitment to a just transition that it's becoming abundantly clear that this was simply a fake promise to begin with, net zero by name and net zero in action. Furthermore, we are continuing to make it increasingly difficult for our working rural population to travel to and from work, with delayed road schemes and a failing rail network. In this budget, nothing for the A96 improvements, nothing for North East Rail improvements. This government has promised time and time again to do something about our roads in the North East, whether that be the A9 or the A96. Yet continually, progress has been delayed, stopped, put back with cries of "it wasn't me" resonating around, but the North East has had enough. We want to see action on these dangerous roads. This government must stop passing the buck and take action. If it doesn't, the price has to be paid is too high. More accidents, more deaths. It's simply no longer acceptable. It never was to push this issue into the long grass. We need action now. And on rail, this net zero government has promised £200 million in rail improvements for the North East by 2026. Yet only £8 million has been spent. Why? More buck passing, more obfuscation, another broken promise. Our rural communities are sick and tired of warm words and empty promises, Presiding Officer. Out of ideas, out of policy and out of time. In closing, Presiding Officer, I want to for a moment talk about the businesses in central Aberdeen. I confess that there is not much Christmas cheer around when you meet some of the business owners that I have been speaking to. They are facing the triple whammy of a low-emission zone that is impacting their businesses, bus gates that are preventing access to their businesses, business rates that are sucking the life out of their profits and ability to continue in business. The Scottish Conservatives are pleading with the Cabinet Secretary to please pass on the business rate exemption for pubs and restaurants to mitigate this triple blow to their businesses. And it's immoral that the SNP government received £145 million in Barnett consequentials for this and are only passing on a fraction of that. This budget will sound the death knell for many of our local pubs, favourite restaurants, important industry and valued projects. We cannot risk the loss of these vital resources in our communities, and this budget puts at risk the very heart of our communities. The net zero government for sure, killing our industry and entrepreneurship, devastating our oil and gas sector, an enemy of road development and improvement, against improving our rail network, an absolute disgrace. Out of ideas, out of policy and out of time, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Lumsden. I now call John Mason to be followed by Emma Roddick. Mr Mason.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. And I would just remind Mr Lumsden that this Parliament is here to consider how to spend money and not just copy what they do at Westminster. And I thank the Conservatives for showing us something today in this afternoon's motion of their true colours. Firstly, they emphasise tax and taxpayers as if tax was a bad thing, and they claim that Scotland has high taxes, whereas in fact we know that both the UK and Scotland have relatively low taxes in comparison with many other European countries. It is because taxes are too low that we are having to choose between winter heating payments for pensioners and bus travel for asylum seekers. We should be able to do both, but it is a choice for all the parties here. Do we want decent public services paid for by higher taxes, or do we want a country with poor roads, a shortage of houses and long NHS waiting times because our taxes are too low? It is quite a simple question, really. Mr Lumsden, if he wants to give way.
Douglas Lumsden.
I'm confused by what Mr Mason is saying, because we've actually got higher taxes and our roads are crumbling. Does he not accept that we've got all these things?
John Mason.
No, I do not accept that, because other countries with better public services like Denmark have much higher taxes and are much more successful. The Conservatives once again seek to link higher taxes with a lack of economic growth, yet their own experience in government at Westminster has shown that there has often been very poor growth at the same time as low taxes. The two need not be linked. Personally, I welcome... No, I'm not giving way again, just now. Personally, I welcome growth in the economy, but then the question arises as to who benefits from that growth. Taxes are at least part of the answer to that. If taxes are kept low, a few lucky people get richer and richer, while other hard-working people who are in low-paid jobs and do not own their own homes do not benefit from that growth. In my opinion, freezing council tax last year was a mistake, and if local councils now decide on more substantial increases in council tax this coming year, I do not think we can blame them for that. We have protected NHS funding over recent years, and the result is that local government has faced a real squeeze. And I do question how much longer we should protect NHS funding in this way and automatically pass on all Barnett consequentials to them. There is broad agreement we should do more in preventative spending, and that probably means giving more to local councils, who are often very active in that space. And while we're on the subject of local councils, we do need to replace council tax. No time is ideal, and any new system will see losers complaining loudly, while winners potentially remain largely silent. But as every year goes past, the council tax system becomes less fair, and I would argue that in poorer areas like the East End of Glasgow, with lower property values which rise more slowly, which are losing out, while areas with more costly homes are the relative winners. I'm particularly pleased affordable housing features strongly in the budget, and spending is to be restored or reinstated to previous levels. However, we are in a housing emergency, which might suggest that we should be going beyond just restoring or reinstating. I accept the point made after the budget statement last week that there might not be capacity in the construction sector to immediately increase house building substantially. However, if the word emergency means anything at all, presumably it means that housing is now a higher priority relative to other sectors than it was before. So while road improvements are important, I do not believe that we are facing a roads emergency. Therefore, I would like to see more spent on housing and less on roads. On resource funding, the Scottish Fiscal Commission tell us that for 25-26, it is only up 0.8% on 2024-25 in real terms. So there is no huge pot of gold available. Labour may tell us that it's the highest block grant available, but obviously every year the pound gets worth less, and it would be very strange if it was not the highest level so far. When it comes to spending priorities, I do welcome the increase in social security, up from 9.7% of the budget to 13.5%. I'm not really clear why mitigating the two-child limit was preferred over increasing the Scottish Child Payment. The latter would presumably have been less hassle, no admin costs, and presumably would not have required cooperation by Westminster. The Tories sink to new depths by opposing support for asylum seekers. They say they support the hospitality sector when it means profitable businesses having their rates cut and making extra profit. I wonder if they have looked recently at the definition of hospitality. The Cambridge Dictionary tells us it means, quote, the act of being friendly and welcoming to guests and visitors, unquote. So how does that fit in with refusing help to asylum seekers, who are often living on a pittance anyway and cannot afford to travel even within Glasgow? I have a friend who had to step over dead bodies in the street outside his home when escaping from his country, and we cannot pay his bus fare? Finally, I do think we need to accept that the fiscal framework is broken and needs completely rewritten. We cannot compete with London and the south east of England, although we can with other parts of the UK. And secondly, Barnett is gradually cutting our spending year by year. So Scotland is in a lose-lose situation in regards to the rest of the UK. I accept that the Cabinet Secretary told us last year that a fundamental rewriting was not on the table and that it is not her fault. However, I think we should at least accept that the present fiscal framework is weighted against Scotland, and other things being equal, it ensures that Scotland loses out as each year goes by. In my relatively new independent status, I will be supporting the SNP government budget when we get to voting on it. However, that will not stop me commenting on various points. But on today's Conservative motion, I hope we can all agree that it is cruel and only panders to the Reform Party agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mason. And I call Emma Roddick. Ms Roddick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As inherently comfortable as I am when my party puts forward a budget that the Conservatives describe as disastrous, I can't help but feel when listening to the debate today that this is what they would say regardless of what was in the budget document. Because the messaging from Conservatives lately is all over the place. They are so desperate to criticise anyone and everyone else that this afternoon alone we've had Tory MSPs shout at the Cabinet Secretary for our social security spending and at Michael Mara for Labour's social security cuts. Tim Eagle wants more rural spending, Sandesh Gohani more for the NHS. So I ask them and whose taxes, because they're also arguing for less taxation for those with the most money. So they want more spending and less money available to spend. Their leader is othering people who are seeking asylum, arguing for the money to go to pensioners instead. Now, I've got news for them. That is social security spending. They need to pick an ideology. This is clearly a party in search of a policy base, and for some reason today they've picked Nigel Farage's. We should always go back to the facts, like that we are in a cost of living crisis. So it would be concerning to me if the Scottish social security budget were not large. It should not matter if you are a child, a pensioner or any other age. We should be preventing anyone falling into poverty whenever we reasonably can. 50% of taxpayers in Scotland pay less than they would in England, and we're asking those with the broadest shoulders to help us eradicate child poverty and fund the NHS. That is a consistent and moral stance. The Conservatives are free to disagree with it, but they should at least be honest about why and where they should suggest that we find the £1.7 billion that we have because we didn't follow UK policy on taxes. And as for economic growth, the richest getting richer is not going to help the communities that we represent. When people have little income, they spend that money, and often locally. They do not hoard it. So yes, I'm unapologetic about the position of taxing wealth and making sure that other people can feed their kids. And I support efforts like expanding the free bus travel scheme to people seeking asylum and to supporting young islanders with free inter-island ferry travel, which is giving them opportunities that they may not otherwise have had to take up one of the many vacancies in Shetland or Lewis or another of our precious island communities, which need more people who can be economically active. But there is a more sinister aspect to the debate today that I won't ignore. People seeking asylum, who could also be economically active if the Conservatives had acted with a shred of decency when they were in Whitehall, deserve better from their representatives than the Tories suggesting to pensioners that these people are taking their benefits. If MSPs want to finally talk about giving these people enough money to live on, or the right to work, or decent lodgings, then I'm happy to get into that conversation. But it is disgraceful to ensure poverty in law for a marginalised group and then criticise the government when it has to step in and make sure that they can access immigration advice, healthcare and, where possible, work by helping them just to get on the bus. Yes, certainly.
Paul Sweeney.
Thank the member for giving way. She makes a very powerful point, which she also recognises that the people who genuinely profit out of the asylum system are the large private contractors who often get very lucrative housing contracts from the government, such as Circle and Mears.
Emma Roddick.
Yeah, absolutely. Recent immigration policies have not only been punitive to the people that we should be supporting, but they also just do not make economic sense. And I hope that the Members' Party will be considering making huge changes to much of the legislation that was brought in under the previous government around immigration. And this kind of measure might not be necessary if successive UK governments hadn't spent so much time and energy doing exactly what the Scottish Conservatives are doing today, creating a hostile environment towards people who are exercising a basic human right to seek refuge in Scotland. I do always flinch when I see common sense, because really what the Tories mean when they say common sense is people agreeing with us, and that is neither sensible nor, according to recent polling, common. The Cabinet Secretary and many members across all parties have been correct to call out the dog whistles in the Conservative motion. Now, when I was young, I used to watch this chamber and feel very proud that every party, even those I would never consider joining, had respect for each other and for those that they represent. When school kids take part in the Donald Dewar debating tournament, they get to see clips of parties in this place disagreeing respectfully and showing empathy for people in communities across Scotland. Any young people watching today will be seeing the Scottish Conservatives othering some of the most marginalised people in society for political gain. And even the Conservatives themselves know that it's nonsense, because they don't have a list of 6,600 pensioners that they think should get a share of £2 million when it would cost over £100 million to pay all of them. They have no plan for actually redistributing that money in any kind of fair way, because there isn't one. They are simply and shamefully using refugees as pawns to play up the voters that they are losing to the far right, instead of doing what any decent representative would do and stand against and apart from these dangerous ideas. We have a duty, all of us, to protect people in this country from fascism and act with basic humanity, inspire and motivate people through leadership. And fair play to Labour for clearly and unequivocally condemning the language in the motion and showing that leadership and humanity. How the Tories can fail to do so today is absolutely beyond me, and I hope that they get the reckoning they deserve for it in 2026. Much of the world is incredibly unsafe right now. We have to do better than this. The Scottish Government has made some excellent decisions in this budget, and the UK Government could make lives easier by working with us instead of against us. And I hope that the other parties in this chamber will support this set of proposals, which can do so much for Scotland and is opposed so strongly by the party that would bring such a disgraceful motion to our Parliament.
Thank you, Ms Roddick. We will now move to closing speeches, and I call on Ross Greer to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 6 minutes, please, Mr Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and it was remiss of me not to apologise at the start for being a few moments late. I missed the business was running ahead of time. I wanted to start off just with a point of frustration with the recent financial decision the Government's made, and that's dropping its commitment to introduce an infrastructure levy in Scotland. The powers to introduce that levy are time limited. They will expire in 2026 unless it's introduced. And I think it's right. Parliament agreed last session that it was right for developers to contribute towards the creation of communities. And that requires infrastructure. The Government is quite rightly committed to people being able to live in an area where the services they need day to day are within 15 minutes of their home. You can't do that without the funding for that infrastructure. But that being said, I do welcome the Scottish Government's overall welcome an intervention.
Just an intervention on that specific point. It's an important point. We carefully considered and talked to many stakeholders about the infrastructure levy, but we recognised that the Section 75 contributions, which raise far more than would ever be raised through an infrastructure levy, are the best vehicle for directing funding to the mechanisms that the issues that Ross Greer rightly identifies. We continue to work with stakeholders to maximise the use of 75 as the most efficient delivery mechanism for raising and delivering that funding.
Ross Greer.
I'm grateful for the intervention, but Section 75 orders aren't working. That's why Parliament agreed last session to introduce the infrastructure levy, but I'll happily engage with the Minister in more detail on some of the issues around why that's the case. I do welcome the Minister and the Cabinet Secretary's engagement on the budget, though. There's been a clear effort to meet the Greens' red lines around climate and nature spending, the £4.9 billion that we're running through the detail of at the moment, and the real terms increase to council funding, as well as policies I mentioned previously, the increase to the additional dwelling supplement, free ferry travel for young islanders, yes, free bus travel for those seeking asylum, the cross-party proposals to reintroduce or restore the winter fuel payment. And I do look forward to further discussions around areas that the Greens would still prioritise, like the expansion of free school meals, the bus fare cap, restoring the cut to the Nature Restoration Fund. The public expect compromise and they expect Parliament to agree a budget. The Greens are, of course, willing to engage in that discussion. We appreciate the efforts that the Scottish Government has made so far. There's a few points from this afternoon's debate that I want to touch on, though. Craig Hoy and Murdo Fraser had a lot to say about social security. Craig Hoy described the adult disability payment as soft touch, and Murdo Fraser talked about needing to get people off welfare and into work. But we know from huge amounts of experience that the way you support people into work isn't by taking away the limited support they already have, it's by giving them the additional support that they need. And I would point out to the Conservatives, absolutely not, I would point out to the Conservatives the evidence of excess deaths as a result of Tory austerity. The British Medical Association estimates 190,000 people died in the UK as a result of Conservative austerity. The Glasgow Centre for Population Health estimate is as high as 330,000. That's the result of being punitive on the most vulnerable, those who rely on our social security system in particular. Tim Eagle mentioned cuts to Nature Scott's budget, something that I'm also concerned about, but I find that hard to square with the Conservatives' proposal to merge and therefore save money by merging environmental agencies like Nature Scott and SEPA. And I wonder if that proposal has been ran by the staff of Nature Scott in Tim Eagle's region at their Inverness HQ, or Murdo Fraser's constituents who work at SEPA's HQ in Stirling, because, as Emma Roddick pointed out, it's hard to square where the Conservatives are demanding more money with the areas that they're proposing cutting. Alex Cole-Hamilton mentioned a range of proposals that the Liberal Democrats proposed for this budget and have appeared in the draft, and I want to credit them for that. The Greens and the Liberal Democrats have demonstrated the impact that parties from opposition can have when they engage constructively as part of this process, because our constituents want us to have an impact on their lives far more than they want us to secure party political advantage over each other at the subsequent election. And the public do want value for money, and we can always do better on that. We can always spend better. The First Minister challenged all parties to face up to difficult choices. I would put that back on the First Minister when it comes to the small business bonus scheme in particular, given that the government's own review found no evidence of positive economic outcomes from that, and whether that's really good value of £250 million a year. But I think overall progressives do need a better story to tell when it comes to public service reform. We cannot concede that ground to the right, who simply want to shrink the state. Now, Liz Smith made a fair challenge. I'm afraid not, so I'm going to have to start rounding off in a minute. Liz Smith made a fair challenge on the sustainability of our public finances, and on that we agree. They're not sustainable at the moment, and Liz Smith will know that the Greens don't lack for solutions when it comes to increasing the revenue required to fund public services. We would start by replacing the comically outdated council tax and introducing a public health levy on supermarkets who make large profits selling cheap alcohol and tobacco. Like colleagues, I would like to congratulate the Labour Party for the first line of their amendment, the unequivocal condemnation of the Conservatives' attempt to turn vulnerable groups against each other. And I think it was right that Alec Rowley and Michael Mara read into the record the comments that have been made by the Catholic Church and the Church of Scotland today during the season of Advent, where we welcome the Christ child, an outsider and a refugee, into the world. I agree, of course, with Michelle Thompson on the need for borrowing powers to invest And John Mason and I regularly agree on issues of public finance, and today was no different on the comments he made around the housing emergency and the need to reprioritise money perhaps away from road spending into that. Any outcome-based budgeting process, I think, would result in that conclusion. Parliament is expected to show leadership in society, not to punch down, as Paul Sweeney says. We are expected to bring society together, and we've seen elsewhere what happens when societies are divided by opportunistic politicians. We will negotiate over the budget. That's normal. We will gain advantage for our parties through the process, I'm sure. That is normal. But we can never allow it to become normal in this Parliament to pit the most vulnerable groups in our society against each other. And I'm proud that the vast majority of MSPs this afternoon will reject attempts to do that. I would urge the Conservative colleagues who have sat through this debate in great discomfort to show the courage of their convictions and join us in rejecting the motion today.
Thank you, Mr Greer. I now call on Daniel Johnson to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's actually quite a difficult debate to know how to sum up properly. But I have to say, it does actually give me great pleasure to follow on Ross Greer, because I think he made some important contributions, along with others, Alex Cole-Hamilton, Alec Rowley, indeed the Cabinet Secretary, my colleague Michael Mara, because I think it's important to note what is wrong with this motion. To pit one vulnerable group against another is not right, and I am glad that the churches came together to call that out. And I'm trying to articulate in normal terms. It would be very easy to be hyperbolic, and I really don't want to be, because one of the secrets in this place, and I think we all know this secret, is there's only 129 of us, and we all know each other. Actually, we probably get on a lot better on an individual basis than we probably care to let on. But when we get into this big room, it's probably a bit easier to have the knockabout, to have the big arguments, and then we hope that no one notices us who we're talking to in the tea rooms or in the, on our way down the corridor. Just in a moment, Mr Kern, and I will take you. But I want to say earnestly, I've got a number of friends across this chamber, including on those benches, and I won't embarrass you, and I know this isn't you. I know you don't really think that scrapping bus passes for refugees will actually raise the revenue that all the rest of the measures in your motion add up to. I know you don't think that. I know you don't agree with the politics that seeks to other a group. Now, actually, the real disservice of this policy in some ways is it probably doesn't go far enough. I mean, refugees are incredibly vulnerable. They exist in really difficult circumstances. My worry is that we have a budget measure that has a bus pass for refugees, and we think it's done. That's the real problem with this. I'm very happy to give way to Mr Kerr.
Stephen Kerr.
Daniel Johnson is going on at great length about bus passes for refugees or asylum seekers. If he's so in favour of that measure, if he thinks it's such a moral right that those of us who oppose it are somehow moral degenerates because of that, why has his Labour government at Westminster not introduced a similar measure in England and in fact have said that they will not introduce such a measure?
Daniel Johnson.
Let's have that debate about what refugees might need or might not need, but let's not use language of condemns. Condemns. That's what it says. Look, it is really telling, genuinely, it's really telling how few Conservative members were actually willing to speak to that very precise recommendation in your motion. You all sidestepped it.
We always need to speak through the chair, Mr Johnson.
Apologies, Deputy Presiding Officer. We are at a fork in the road in Scottish politics. We really are, because we've all seen the results from the council by-elections. We've seen Reform increase their share of the vote, and I understand the position that puts us all in, because we all know the ease with which populism can come. But let's be clear, that's what Reform represents, is populist politics. Populist about easy appeals to casual prejudice and about false oppositionalism, creating oppositions within society, and we really must reject it. And apart from anything else, because I think actually there is a place for Conservative politics in Scottish politics. I don't agree with it, but some of those traditional Conservative values about traditionalism, about caution when it comes to public policy, socially Conservative, there is a role for that. I disagree with it. I've spent most of my adult life thinking Conservative politics was just a bit boring, too tame, didn't go far enough. I'm genuinely trying to make a clear personal point here. You are at a risk. Sorry, the Conservative Party are at a risk of going down a populist route. I think it's very dangerous. And I think Emma Roddick was absolutely right. We all know what common sense is a code word for. And it is that populism, because it's not really common sense. It's about politics, which really only relies on the inherent prejudices that exist within society without backing up with policy, without backing up with data, without backing up with reason. And there was a debate we could have and should have had. There was a debate about actually what this budget does not do or what it does do, about the approach that it takes. I very much enjoyed listening to Liz Smith. I think she made a very important contribution, because we do have to think about how policy joins up. It's not just good enough to talk about what the benefits of social security policy is, but how does that have a wider economic benefit? Likewise, I very much enjoyed Kenny Gibson, and if I have one very brief moment of levity, I was amused by his condemnation of grandstanding. I know it's not something he would never indulge in himself. But this point around where on the spectrum does this budget lie in terms of that, dealing with strategic issues, that land of milk and honey and the utter disaster, because it is somewhere on that spectrum. And I would say that I think there are things. We have to listen to IFS. There are some very serious challenges we face around demography, around the level of investment we have, around the infrastructure. I mean, even on the points of roads that Douglas Lumsden mentioned. So much of what is distinctive about Scotland relies on that sort of infrastructure. And again, a presentation of politics that it's either you're for roads or you're against roads is really, really unhelpful. But we didn't have that debate. We didn't have that debate that we could have had. In fact, it's a debate I think we need to have as part of the regular budget process. Because it's not enough just to have questions in a statement when the budget's first published. We actually should be talking about it much more in the round. And we had the opportunity to do that, but we didn't. And we didn't have that because of that line in the Conservative motion about condemning free bus travel.
Mr Johnson, could you bring your remarks to close?
I will, for asylum seekers. And I think we should all think about that. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Johnson. I now call on Minister Ivan McKee to close on behalf of the Scottish Government. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And I want to start up where Daniel Johnson left off, because I think the tone he's set in his remarks are absolutely appropriate to the situation we find ourselves in, debating this Tory motion this afternoon. And I pay tribute to the contributions of Michael Mara, who addressed this head-on, and also to Paul Sweeney, who talked eloquently about the importance of the measure for asylum seekers transport, the free bus travel that's included in our budget. I think this points to, sadly, the further demise of the Tory party. And we had some breaking news this afternoon, at 2:30 this afternoon. Bloomberg broke the story that the Tories and Reform are already in talks about electoral pacts. Discussions have focused on the idea that local Conservative associations could stand down candidates in some districts to give Reform, led by Nigel Farage, a better chance of winning seats. So that, unfortunately, Presiding Officer, is the reality that we find ourselves in.
Let us hear the Minister. I was just asking that we be allowed to hear the Minister. Do continue.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, because these are important matters that we're debating this afternoon. Alice Cole-Hamilton made some very valuable points, I think, about the economic value and the social value of those free bus passes. And it's really important to recognise that study after study and data after data shows the economic value of immigrants to society is very, very significant. And if the Tories are serious about economic growth in the economy, they should absolutely recognise that those immigrant communities and those asylum seekers have got a very considerable economic value to add to our society. Presiding Officer, the Tories are... indeed, I shall.
Alice Cole-Hamilton.
Grateful to the Minister for giving way. I think his remarks about the social value of giving free bus passes to asylum seekers speak to the very heart of this debate about the iniquity and the shrivelled moral bankruptcy of the Conservative Party trying to pit one social group, one very vulnerable group, against another. That they seem to suggest that the way to maximise the credit...
Mr Cole-Hamilton, I would ask members to resist any temptation to contribute when they haven't been called to speak. Mr Cole-Hamilton.
They seem to suggest that by pitting one vulnerable group against another, that we can maximise the economic benefit to one very vulnerable group by stripping the very limited benefits we offer another is somehow an answer, a way forward. But they have not listened to the church. They have not listened to parties across this chamber rail against that iniquity, that moral bankruptcy today. And I am ashamed of many of my parliamentary colleagues in the Conservative benches, many of whom know better.
Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And again, I think Alex Cole-Hamilton makes this point very well. The Tories are not only morally bankrupt, but also economically illiterate. And we've seen from the letters from Russell Finlay, 2 letters, one that asked for £1 billion in tax cuts, and then he realised he had to figure out how he was going to pay for that. Yeah. So the second one came out with about £50 million at best case in terms of spending reductions, and of those, Kerry Gibson has gone through. In addition to that, another long list of spending asks from the Conservative members across the chamber. And George Adam made the point very well. What have babies ever done to the Tories? Craig Hoy.
Craig Hoy.
I thank the Minister for taking that intervention. He's on the record as saying that further tax rises would be counterproductive in Scotland. Why?
Minister.
It's absolutely critical to get that balance right, and I think that we've done that in the budget that we've taken forward. And the problem that the Conservatives have is they don't understand that it's a government that continues to balance its budget year after year, despite the great uncertainties of the Sorry.
Let's hear the Minister.
You want to intervene?
Mr.
We do balance our budget. We balance our budget every year.
Minister. Mr. Kerr, I know that you know that only one member should be speaking at any time, and that will be the member that the presiding officer has called. I cannot recall calling you Mr. Kerr. Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I know the Tories don't want to hear this, indeed.
Liz Smith.
Does the Minister recognise that the ability to balance a budget is a legal requirement, and it's not up to the different choices that the Scottish Government? It's a legal requirement, is it not?
Minister.
The fact that it's a legal requirement doesn't make it any easier, and this government does it year after year after year, which demonstrates that we're in control of the finances. We understand that balance between taxes and spending, and we make sure that those balance every single year. And members are laughing. They clearly don't understand how the fiscal realities work. This is Scotland's economy, with higher long-term growth, double the rate of productivity growth and growth over the last 17 years since this government's been in power compared to the rest of the UK. Lower unemployment, higher average wages, the best performing FDI, foreign direct investment, across the UK outside of London for the last 9 years, delivered by Scottish Development International, that the Tories want to cut their international offices. Presiding Officer, while the Tories are focused on those ridiculous sound bites, this Scottish Government is focused on those sound investments, making sure we've got that international footprint that can deliver FDI to create jobs and wealth and grow Scotland's economy. Have I got
Minister
time
must
for?
Be concluding.
Right. So, very briefly, Presiding Officer, in conclusion, it's the Tories, Douglas Lumsden, can't bring himself to welcome the £150 million investment in offshore wind. Tim Eagle doesn't recognise the £22 million increase in the rural budget, and the NUF Scotland do recognise that. Their main ask of securing that £46 million capital spend, they thank us for that, and they look forward to working with the Scottish Government to deliver on that. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, we are serious about public service reform. We are working very hard to deliver on that, and have really significant savings as a consequence of that work so far. This government has its priorities: reducing child poverty, growing the economy, tackling the climate emergency, and providing those high quality and sustainable public services. We will continue to focus on that, while the Tory party in Scotland, unfortunately, has been sidetracked down a cul-de-sac trying to do a deal with reform, something the people of Scotland will not thank them for. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, and I call on Murdo Fraser to wind up the debate. Up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, we're 1 week on from the publication of the Scottish Government's budget. There's been a real opportunity this afternoon, for the first time, to properly scrutinise what was in that budget and to cut through the spin. And that's exactly what we've heard from my colleagues on the benches behind me, in contrast to the sanctimonious claptrap we've had of some of the other benches this afternoon. Now, we know as sure as night follows day that the SNP will always complain about any budget settlement it gets from this UK Government. This year, it surely had less cause to complain than ever before, because the block grant for the coming year is the highest it has been in the history of devolution, nearly double what it was in real terms when devolution commenced 25 years ago. The uplift for this year to next is some £3.4 billion, a record increase. Now, I've got real issues about how the Labour government has raised the money to provide that, but it is a fact that this government here will have more money in the coming year than ever before. And despite that unprecedented sum of money, all we see around us are deteriorating public services. Our NHS is in crisis, treating fewer patients than before COVID and with longer waiting lists than ever before. We only have to look at the Auditor General's report and the criticisms he made of the lack of reform in the NHS to see that money is simply not being properly spent, as Sandesh Gohani said earlier. I see Michelle Thompson wants to intervene. I'll give way.
I thank Murdo Fraser for allowing me to intervene. And as one of my colleagues commented, you make the same speech every year, record sums of money coming to the Scottish Government. I wonder when he last sat down and worked out the cumulative effect of inflation and then compared the Scottish Government's budget against that. It's as though he's living in isolation.
Murdo Fraser.
Well, presiding officer, I'm really surprised. Michelle Thompson is a very experienced parliamentarian, doesn't understand what the term "in real terms" means. The Scottish Government's budget has nearly doubled in real terms since devolution was first established. Now, presiding officer, of course, the block grant is only one component in the overall budget. The other determining factor are the receipts from the devolved taxes, principally income tax. And these are lower than they should be, because according to the Scottish Fiscal Commission, the SNP's failure to grow our economy over the past year cost the Scottish budget a staggering £634 million. That's money we would otherwise have had to spend on public services had we seen economic growth and wages match the rest of the UK. And that's why we make no apology for saying our focus needs to be on growing the economy to at least match the levels of average UK growth. Now, the SNP will argue... yes, I'll give way to Mr Mason. Yeah.
John Mason.
Would he accept that virtually no region of Europe can compete with London and the South East, and the fiscal framework is broken in that respect?
Murdo Fraser.
Well, it was Mr Mason's government. Of course, I know he's no longer in the SNP. It was Mr Mason's government, Mr Swinney, when he was Finance Secretary, who negotiated the fiscal framework. And Mr Mason has a problem with it. Take it up with this lot. Don't take it up with us, presiding officer. Now, the SNP will argue in this budget they are cutting taxes for the lowest paid. That generous tax cut amounts, as we've heard from Craig Hoy, to the grand sum of £12 a year. £11 a month, less than the cost of a first-class stamp. Not enough throughout the year, even to send a dozen Christmas cards to friends and family. Of course, I'll give way.
Cabinet Secretary.
Of course, the fact that Murdo Fraser is not mentioning is that those in the lowest half of the income distribution will be over about £450 better off a year when you take tax and social security together. Surely that's something Murdo Fraser would welcome.
Murdo Fraser.
Well, presiding officer, the Finance Secretary hasn't been paying attention to what's been happening with councils across Scotland setting their council tax for the coming year. On the very same day that she was making her statement to Parliament last week, Perth and Ross Council in my own region agreed council tax increases for coming years, 10%
Let's hear Mr.
next
Fraser.
year, 10% the following year, 6% the following year, a cumulative uplift of 28%. Other councils are talking about even higher council tax increases. And these eye-watering increases will not even fund better services, because the same councils having to take those decisions are those councils closing libraries, shutting down public toilets, reducing teacher numbers, spending less on parks and verge maintenance, along with a host of other cost-cutting measures. People are paying much more and getting less in return. Nor, presiding officer, was there real help for business in this budget, because for the last 2 years, the UK Conservative Government gave retail, hospitality and leisure businesses a 75% rates relief, a choice not taken by the SNP, despite having the Barnett consequentials to fund it. And instead, Shona Robertson announced this year a 40% rates relief for the year coming, but not for retail, hospitality and leisure, only for hospitality and only for those businesses with a rateable value up to 51,000, excluding more than 2,000 licensed premises above the cut-off point. I'm sorry to Mr Brown, I've taken a number of interventions. I'm going to run out of time. So Mr Alan Henderson, owner of Aberdeen's McGuinty Group, said the sector had been completely shafted by the policy. Paul Waterston of the Scottish Licensed Trade Association warned that larger licensed premises were wondering if they could now survive. And of course, as both Craig Hoy and Douglas Lumsden reminded us, the Finance Secretary had in Barnett consequentials from this policy £145 million. How much of that did she pass on? 22 million, less than one-fifth of the sum available to her. And even if she could do it for 1 year, what a boost that would be to struggling hospitality businesses if she made that choice, presiding officer. And the anger doesn't stop there. Donald McCaskill of Scottish Care could not have been more outspoken in his response to the budget when he said, "This is a budget that kills. It will kill any reassurance that the Scottish Government truly values social care. It will kill essential community services which are forced to close and leave workers without employment, and ultimately it will kill people." So where, presiding officer, has all the money gone? Certainly public sector workers have seen above-inflation pay rises without any expectation of increased productivity. And there has been substantial growth in the welfare budget, up £800 million, with the Scottish Fiscal Commission calculating Scotland now pays out £1.3 million more in benefits than prior to the devolution of welfare. And that is even before the additional cost of scrapping the two-child benefit cap, should indeed that ever come in. We can't, as a nation, go on paying out more and more in welfare payments. What we have to do is get people off welfare and into work. There are far too many people of working age claiming benefits who should be contributing to the economy. And that's why we are unapologetic when we say we want to see the overall welfare budget reduced. Presiding officer, our alternative approach as Scottish Conservatives would see more support for Scottish pensioners with winter fuel payments. It would see more support for hard-working families with cuts in income tax, and more support for struggling Scottish hospitality businesses with a 40% rates relief for retail, leisure and hospitality, and a specific 100% rates relief for hospitality for the coming year, recognising the serious pressures affecting that industry. Presiding officer, I was intrigued to see last week the Deputy First Minister, not in the Chamber this afternoon for the debate, but someone who has the economy in her brief, reportedly telling a business... Oh, she is here. She's here now. She is there. Welcome her. Well, I was intrigued to see her telling a business breakfast apparently it was up to the opposition in this Parliament to push for a more business-friendly budget. Now, I might have thought, presiding officer, that was her job in government, but we are very happy to assist. That is why today we are proposing real support for business, real support for households, real support for pensioners. That's what's covered in our motion, and I commend it to Parliament. Thank you.